Hey there, you're about to watch this compilation of hand-drawn and animated history videos we made. If you want to watch our newest videos right when they come out, be sure to subscribe to our main channel, Serious History. Alright, let me get the lights for you. Here are the most epic 1v1 fights in human history. Number 1, Jean de Carouge vs Jacques Le Gris. We're gonna start off with one of the most brutal 1v1 fights in recorded history, when jealousy turned best friends into mortal enemies who end up fighting to the death. It's the late 14th century in France, and two men named Jean de Carouge and Jacques Le Gris are squires serving under a local count in Lower Normandy. This is smack dab in the middle of the 100 Years' War, so Jean and Jacques often find themselves fighting side by side against the English. Their time together on the battlefield leads to a strong friendship. So strong, in fact, that when Jean's wife gives birth to his first son, he asks Jacques to become the child's godfather. So life is good for Jean, but things begin to sour when the count they've been serving under dies, and the position is inherited by a man named Pierre d'Alençon. Both Jean and Jacques, having been loyal subjects, are invited to join the new count's inner circle. Nice! But for some reason, he begins to heavily favor Jacques over Jean. The favoritism makes Jean insanely jealous, and this jealousy quickly destroys their friendship. On top of this, around the same time, Jean's wife and his young son fall ill and pass away. Heartbroken and lost, and with no reason to stick around in Normandy, Jean decides to get away from it all and goes off to England to fight in the 100 Years' War. Tales of his bravery make it back to France, and when he returns home, Jean is kind of a war hero. He meets and marries a beautiful young noble named Marguerite de Thibauville. Things are finally starting to look up again for our guy. But this marriage turns out to be the thing that ultimately ends the friendship between Jean and Jacques for good. See, by this time, the two former friends haven't seen each other in years, but with Jean back in town planning to settle down again with his new wife, they both end up at a party celebrating the birth of a neighbor's son. They bump into each other and get to talking, and they kind of remember why they were such good friends long ago. I know, like, why are we even mad at each other anyway? Oh, by the way, this is my wife Marguerite. Bro, I'm like right here. Jacques is immediately attracted to Marguerite, and now he's jealous of Jean. But she's the wife of his friend, who is kind of like, not his friend anymore, but is kind of his friend again. What is he gonna do? Well, what he ends up doing is actually pretty f***ed up. See, Jean needs to earn more money, so he decides to go off to fight the English again. Only this time, his campaign is a complete failure. Against all odds, he somehow survives, and for his bravery, he's knighted by the King of France, and he has to travel to Paris to collect his wages from the campaign. At the exact same time, Jean's mother has to go on a business trip. They all live together in a huge estate, by the way, and when she leaves, she takes all of the servants and guards with her, leaving Jean's new wife, Marguerite, all alone at home. Now, Jacques hears about this and goes to Jean's home. He sends one of his man-at-arms to knock on the door, and Marguerite, left without any servants or guards, opens the door herself. The soldier tells her that Jacques is here, and he's desperately in love with her and needs to see her right now. She refuses, but as she tries to close the door, Jacques forces his way in and... oh boy. Let's just say he does the thing that rhymes with the word grapes? Violated, Marguerite is on the floor crying, and as he leaves, Jacques threatens her, saying if she tells anyone, she's dead. Jean returns home, and Marguerite tells him everything. He's furious and immediately files a criminal case against Jacques. But guess who the judge is? That D-bag Count Pierre, Jacques' new best friend, and the case is thrown out immediately. Jean goes to Paris to appeal the case to the King of France himself. He shows the people in Paris that Marguerite is now pregnant. I mean, come on! But this doesn't do much because common knowledge of the day says that it was impossible to get pregnant from... grapes? With no witnesses other than Marguerite and Jacques, the courts say that they have no way to determine who's telling the truth. So Jean demands a trial by combat, an archaic form of judgment where two men fight to the death to see who's correct. If the courts can't decide who's telling the truth, they'll let God decide by shining fortune on one of them. Jacques is also pissed that his name is getting dragged through the mud, so he countersues Jean for defamation and agrees to the duel. Now, by this time in France, trial by combat was considered pretty barbaric and not something civilized people should be doing, but the king, he's actually super into the idea. Like, so much so that when there's a chance he might miss the fight, he pushes the whole event back to make sure he can be there. So, on December 29, 1386, the king, along with a crowd of nobles and spectators, gather at the Abbey of Saint-Martin-de-Champs in Paris to witness these two former friends fight to the death. Marguerite is also there, dressed in black, as today may also be her funeral. If Jean loses, it will mean that God has decided she was lying and she would be burned at the stake as punishment. Before the bout begins, official orders from the king are read to the crowd. Throughout the event, no one is to say a word. If anyone does, they'll have a hand cut off as punishment. You can't have anyone putting curses on the combatants and clouding God's judgment after all. Both men are dressed in full steel-plated armor and carry into the arena the holy trinity of weapons: a lance, a battle axe, and a longsword, along with a long dagger. The battle will begin on horseback and continue until one man submits or dies. The two men mount their horses at opposite ends of the arena and are handed their lances. The trial of combat begins, and the two men charge towards each other and strike the shields of their opponent. Both reeling, they ready for a second pass, and this time both men strike each other in the helmet. Their ears ringing, they charge again for a third pass, again striking each other's shields, splintering their lances in the process. They turn their horses and draw their battle axes and charge in for a fourth pass, and this time Jacques swings his axe and cuts the neck of Jean's horse, killing it instantly. Jean tumbles to the ground. He scrambles back to his feet, turns and swings his axe, slicing the belly of Jacques' horse, who collapses, throwing Jacques to the ground. The two men draw their swords and charge at each other, swinging with evil intent. Jacques is the much larger man, and he quickly begins to gain the upper hand in the duel. He's battering Jean, who's struggling to defend against the powerful blows of his one-time friend. He can only withstand the beating for so long until Jacques finds an opening and stabs Jean in his thigh. The crowd gasps as this fight may soon be coming to an end, and Jacques steps back and looks up towards the spectators. With this small opening, Jean lunges at Jacques and drags him to the ground by his helmet. Lying flat on his back, Jacques cannot stand with his heavy armor weighing him down. Jean mounts him and begins viciously stabbing at his chest with his sword, but as hard as he tries, he cannot pierce the steel plating. He throws his sword to the side and takes out his dagger, and with its handle, he begins to smash at the lock that secures Jacques' faceplate. A final strike breaks the lock, and he rips off the helmet, revealing the face of his one-time best friend. Holding a knife to his throat, Jean demands that Jacques confess to his crimes. Jacques defiantly screams, "In the name of God and on the peril and damnation of my soul, I am innocent!"
What?
With this, Jean can stomach no more disrespect and plunges his dagger into the neck of his former friend, killing him instantly. The crowd erupts into cheers, and pages rush onto the field to treat Jean's wounded leg. Jean limps and kneels in front of the king, who's like, "That was fucking epic!" He gives Jean a prize of 1,000 francs, worth about $300,000 today, and a royal payment of 200 francs a month, which is around 60K in today's money. Jean then limps to his wife Marguerite, and together they ride in a caravan to the Notre Dame Cathedral to give thanks to God for the long-awaited justice. They then live happily ever after. For about 10 years, and then Jean goes off and dies in a crusade. Bro just couldn't retire. Number 2, Miyamoto Musashi vs Sasaki Kojiro. It's not often we get to see two legendary fighters go up against each other in their primes, but this is exactly what happened in this story when Miyamoto Musashi went up against the most skilled swordsman of his time, Sasaki Kojiro, in an epic duel to the death. The date is April 13th, 1612, and on the shore of a small island off the coast of southern Honshu called Ganryujima, a samurai is silently seething in anger as he watches the sun begin to fall in the afternoon sky. He's a tall, powerful man who towers over his disciples, and on his shoulder, he's carrying a giant 3-foot-long sword called a nodachi, a weapon so big, only someone his size could even dream of using it properly. His name is Sasaki Kojiro, a man many at the time considered to be the most skilled swordsman in all of Japan. Months ago, he was challenged to a duel by a ronin named Miyamoto Musashi, and he's impatiently awaiting for his arrival. Musashi is late, and Kojiro is taking it personally. The inconsiderate behavior goes completely against the code of the samurai. The sun continues to set, and finally, a whole 3 hours later, a small boat appears on the horizon, casually drifting in the distance. Musashi is finally here, and Kojiro impatiently rushes to meet him at the shore. Now, Musashi, unlike Kojiro, who is a proper by-the-book samurai, is kind of a weirdo. For one thing, he's super tall for the time, standing nearly 6 feet when most Japanese men of the era were only around 5 feet. His appearance is also very un-samurai-like. His face and clothing are dirty, he never bathes, and his hair is an uncombed mess. Despite all these oddities, Musashi is known throughout the land to be not only dangerous, but also an incredibly cunning warrior. By the age of 29, he had already fought and won 60 duels to the death, killing his first opponent at the age of 13, and he's currently wandering Japan seeking out and challenging the best swordsman he can find to test his skills with the katana. Musashi is well aware of Kojuro's immense talent and knows that this fight will be his greatest challenge to date. The winner today will undoubtedly be deemed the greatest swordsman in all of Japan. Knowing the stakes, he's gone to great lengths to make sure he's given himself every possible advantage in this duel. Musashi nonchalantly steps off the boat looking as dirty and disheveled as ever. He sees Kojuro's face and smirks. Kojuro is fuming after waiting 3 hours for his arrival. Musashi then reveals his chosen weapon for the duel, a crudely carved wooden sword that he had made out of a boat oar. Instead of showing up on time, he had spent the 3 hours carving this thing on the ride over to the island. Seeing this enrages Kojuro even more. Musashi's not even giving him the respect of facing him with his infamous two-sword style, and instead is planning to fight him with this? Without the standard bow to begin the duel, Kojuro begins yelling at Musashi, scolding him for being so late. This disrespect will not go unpunished, and he unsheathes his sword and throws the scabbard to the ground, signaling this will be a duel to the death. Musashi casually comments, "You have already lost if you think you don't need your sheath anymore," and he lifts his wooden sword into a ready position. Kojuro, now fully blinded by rage, charges in using his signature technique called the swallow cut. Musashi barely dodges, and his headband is sliced off his head. He jumps away and positions himself with the setting sun at his back. The late afternoon sun reflecting off the water blinds Kojuro, and he squints to try to keep track of his opponent. Seeing this opening, Musashi heaves his wooden sword and with all his might strikes Kojuro with a blow to his head. Kojuro cannot defend himself properly, and the sound of his skull cracking echoes on the beach, leaving his disciples gasping in shock as his limp body falls lifelessly to the sand. The greatest samurai duel in history is over in just one strike. Musashi, seeing Kojuro's disciples beginning to go from shock to anger, quickly jumps back on his boat, and his oarsman brings him back to the main island with no celebration. Now, you may be saying, okay, that's pretty epic and all, but what was up with the boat oar? Well, that was actually part of Musashi's plan too. He had learned of Kojuro's giant odachi, and knowing he could not beat him with his standard katana, he carved his wooden sword to be 2 inches longer than Kojuro's weapon, taking away his greatest advantage. Musashi had carefully planned every aspect of the fight, from his late arrival, which he expected to upset Kojuro, positioning himself with the sun to his back to blind him, and his wooden sword, giving him the reach he needed to strike safely at a distance. With this victory, he's proven that he was not only the greatest swordsman in all of Japan, but also one of the greatest tacticians as well. Number 3. Andrew Jackson vs. Charles Dickinson. Here in the US, we have a history of electing unhinged psychopaths to the office of the president. And out of everyone who's ever been commander-in-chief, I think Andrew Jackson is probably the craziest person we ever put in there. The guy allegedly participated in over 100 duels, and this story is probably the best example of why you don't ever want to get into a gunfight with a crazy person. Back in 1805, former Tennessee Senator Andrew Jackson is out at the racetracks betting big on his prize horse Truxton. He's supposed to go up against another horse named Plowboy owned by this guy Joseph Irwin. The winning horse was to take home $2,000, big money for the time, and Jackson was confident his horse was going to win. But days before the race, Irwin's horse gets sick and can't run. The men get into a disagreement about how much money Jackson should get from this situation, and most likely, Jackson is being a complete asshole, as he was known to be. Irwin's son-in-law, Charles Dickinson, hears of this and steps in. Dickinson, like Jackson, has a huge ego and a hot temper, and it doesn't take long before the two start slinging insults at each other in private letters and out in public. Dickinson calls Jackson a worthless scoundrel in one letter. And later at a party, he goes on talking shit about Jackson's wife, saying Jackson is getting some guy's leftovers as his wife hadn't even divorced her first husband yet. That one really pisses off Jackson because, well, it was true. Dickinson pops off one last time, writing an article in the local newspaper calling Jackson a poltroon and a coward. Sick burns, and this one sends Jackson off the rails. 3 insults is just too much for him to handle, and he formally challenges Dickinson to a duel. Now, Dickinson is actually totally cool with this, because it's well known that he's an expert marksman with a pistol. Actually, probably one of the best shots in the state. So he accepts the challenge with full confidence he's gonna put that asshole Jackson down for good. Meanwhile, Jackson and his friend, knowing that Dickinson is a way better shot, try to come up with all kinds of harebrained schemes to increase Jackson's chances of winning. They come up with a plan of trying to get Dickinson to shoot first, because maybe they can rush him and he'll miss, and then Jackson would have all the time he needs to aim properly. This strategy did have the risk of Dickinson, not missing, and Jackson dying before he had a chance to shoot. But hey, this was the best they could come up with, and I told you already, Jackson was unhinged to say the least. By this time, dueling was actually illegal in the state of Tennessee, so the men crossed the border into Kentucky, and on the morning of May 30th, 1806, Jackson and Dickinson, along with their seconds, made their way to a secluded spot in Adderville. The 2 men marched to their positions 24 feet apart with their pistols in hand. The duel begins, and Dickinson expertly points his pistol at Jackson, aiming for his chest. He pulls the trigger, and in a flash of gun smoke, sends a lead ball hurtling towards Jackson and scores a direct hit inches from his heart. The former senator staggers back, clutching his chest. Blood seeps out from beneath his hand, staining his shirt, but Jackson does not fall. Dickinson lowers his pistol in disbelief. His aim was true, and that was surely a kill shot. Dueling rules stated that now he must stand still and allow Jackson to take his shot. He looks across the field and can't believe what he's seeing. The injured Jackson, face white as a ghost, still clutching his chest with one hand, slowly raises his pistol and takes aim. Jackson pulls his trigger, and Dickinson winces, expecting an impact, but nothing happens. Jackson's gun has misfired. Now, dueling rules say that a misfire still counts as a shot, and the duel should have been over. But Jackson, he doesn't give a about the rules and recocks his pistol and aims again. He pulls the trigger, and this time the shot rings out. The lead ball hits Dickinson square in the chest, and he falls to the ground. Though people try to save him, he bleeds out and passes away within 24 hours. Jackson's wound is examined by his doctors, and it's discovered that Dickinson's bullet has broken a few of his ribs and is so close to his heart it can't be removed safely. He recovers, but the bullet remains lodged in his chest for the rest of his life, causing him a lot of pain. Jackson's reputation took a major hit from the duel because, he kind of just murdered a guy in cold blood, but not enough to prevent him from becoming president in 1829, which just goes to show you can be a horrible person and still become president of the United States. Here are the most epic brawls in human history. Number 1, the sandbar fight. We're starting off with one of the craziest brawls in American history that made a legend out of a man named Jim Bowie and his signature knife. It's a beautiful fall day on September 19th, 1827, and Samuel Wells and Thomas Maddox have each independently made the long journey from central Louisiana all the way to the remote area of Natchez, Mississippi. Sharing similar ambitions for wealth and power, the 2 men have repeatedly crossed paths and over the years grown to hate each other. Every attempt at peace has devolved into a shouting match, and with no path to settle their grievances with words, they're looking to squash their beef once and for all with a pistol duel on a sandbar island in the middle of the Mississippi River. Like modern-day prize fighters, Wells and Maddox have each brought with them 5 supporters. But if the goal was peace after this duel, the 2 men could not have chosen worse cornermen. Between the supporters were rivalries that were more intense than even that of the duelists themselves, and no 2 men hated each other more than Jim Bowie and Major Norris Wright. Jim Bowie, a friend of Wells, was a large and powerful man who fancied himself as somewhat of a real estate investor. More accurately, he was probably a scam artist selling fake land deeds to newcomers to the frontier. But hey, this is America, right? Understanding what Bowie was doing, Wright denied him a bank loan and began spreading the word around Louisiana that he was a crook. When Bowie hears about this, he hunts Major Wright down to a hotel bar and demands that Wright say what he'd been saying behind his back straight to his face. Major Wright stared back calmly and without warning draws his pistol and fires, aiming directly at Bowie's chest. The bullet somehow hits a coin pouch tucked in Bowie's vest pocket, saving his life, and without thought, he launches himself at Wright. As the Major's friends try to pull them apart, Bowie bites Wright's hand so hard that one of his teeth is left stuck in Wright's flesh as he's pried away. That night, Bowie vows to never be caught unarmed again, and he and his brother have a blacksmith fashion a 9-inch hunting knife that he would begin to carry everywhere. Now, this altercation happened just a year before this duel, so this is all pretty fresh in Bowie's mind, and he has his eyes locked on Wright as soon as he sees him arrive on the sandbar accompanying Maddox. As Wells and Maddox watch their supporters mean mug each other, they realize that they might have made a huge mistake, so they force their supporters to stay far away and remain separated while they have their duel at a distance. Wells and Maddox walk with their seconds, receive their pistols, and take their positions. The signal's given and they fire at each other, but both miss. Their weapons are reloaded, and again they take their place and on command fire for a second time. But again, both shots miss. At this point, the realness of the situation is starting to sink in for both Wells and Maddox, and realizing that dueling sounded a lot cooler before they actually started doing it, the men decide to shake hands and call their beef settled. Honor had been restored to both gentlemen, hooray! And the day ended without any bloodshed at all. Nice! Or that's what they thought. See, as the men and their seconds begin to walk together towards Maddox's camp to get some refreshments, Wells' supporters, General Cooney and Jim Bowie, rush out from their waiting area upset and wondering why the duel is over if they're both still alive. The duelists explain what happened, but Cooney, still craving a day of violence, turns to Robert Crane, his hated rival and Maddox's second, and says, "Colonel Crane, this is a good time to settle our difficulty." And this is when the shit hits the fan. Crane, still holding Maddox's pistol from the duel, aims at Cooney and fires. The bullet misses Cooney, but strikes Bowie in the hip, knocking him to the ground. Cooney draws his pistol and fires at Crane, hitting him in the arm. And immediately, Crane produces his own pistol from his belt and fires back at Cooney. He hits an artery in his thigh and he begins to bleed out. Bowie scrambles to his feet and menacingly unsheathes his knife, looking for revenge after watching his friend get shot. Crane, now holding two empty pistols, throws one at Bowie and hits him square on the forehead, shattering the gun and knocking him to the ground for a second time. Bowie crawls away and slumps against a giant driftwood log to try to regain his composure. The gunshots startle the remaining supporters from both camps, who all begin rushing in, and Major Wright spots his nemesis dazed on the ground. Without hesitation, he rushes towards Bowie, quickly draws his pistol and fires at him, trying to finish him off for good. Bowie rolls out of the way at the last moment, and Wells' second, a man named McWhorter, throws Bowie a pistol, which he quickly fires at Wright and hits him. Screaming, "Damn you, you have killed me!" Wright unsheaths his cane sword and stabs Bowie in the chest, puncturing his left lung. Wright bends over trying to remove his sword from his rival's chest, but it's caught in Bowie's sternum. Bowie quickly swipes at the Major with his free hand and manages to snag a hold of Wright's collar. With the cane sword still lodged in his chest, Bowie pulls himself to his feet and whispers into Wright's ear, "And now, Major, you die." He plunges his knife into the heart of his sworn enemy, taking his life. As Bowie and Wright stand in their bloody embrace, Wright's friends, the Blanchard brothers, fire their pistols at Bowie, and one of the bullets pierces his arm. Bowie quickly shoves Wright's body off of his knife and slashes one of the brothers, cutting his arm and taking him out of the fight. As the brothers begin to flee, the remaining Wells supporters open fire, and the unlucky Blanchard with the gash in his arm adds a bullet wound to his list of injuries. More shots are fired, but no one else scores a hit, and the original duelists finally regain order and stop the violence. The entire brawl lasted just 90 seconds, but two men are dead, and Jim Bowie is severely injured, being shot twice and stabbed in the chest. Crane, having no previous bad blood with Jim Bowie prior to the day's events, helps walk him to the doctors who were standing by at the duel. "Colonel Crane, I do not think, under the circumstances, you ought to have shot me," says Bowie as he's being worked on. Word of the sandbar fight got out amongst the people in the area, and the knife used by Jim Bowie would come to be known as the Bowie knife, one of the most iconic American-made weapons in history. Number 2, Miyamoto Musashi versus the Yoshioka School. It's the spring of 1604, and an unknown 21-year-old swordsman named Miyamoto Musashi arrives in the capital city of Kyoto. The trip is not a vacation. He's here on a mission to seek out and duel a member of the famed Yoshioka School of Swordsmanship. The Yoshioka were once the private instructors of the Ashikaga shogun and are considered the best in the land. Decades ago, Musashi's father Munisai had dueled the founder of the school, Yoshioka Kenpo, and won 2 of the 3 bouts. Musashi is determined to prove to himself and the rest of the world that he's just as skilled as his father, and defeating a member of the Yoshioka school was his first step. The head of the school, Yoshioka Sejuro, quickly accepts. Though Musashi was an unknown name, the Yoshioka never forgot about their founder's defeat at the hands of Munisai, and defeating his son would avenge this loss for their family. The duel is arranged to take place on March 8, 1604, in front of the Rendai No Temple, and just like the duel between Musashi's father and Yoshioka Kenpo, each swordsman will be armed with a wooden sword. On the day of the duel, Seijudo arrives at the agreed upon time, but Musashi is nowhere to be seen. Hours pass, and Seijudo grows more and more impatient. Finally, Musashi arrives and the duel begins, with Seijudo flustered and upset at the disrespect Musashi has shown him. The two engage, but the duel is over in a single strike as Musashi shatters Seijudo's shoulder, leaving him unable to grasp a sword ever again. When he recovers, he is humiliated. He gives up his school and becomes a monk. Musashi had achieved his goal, and his short time in Kyoto was at its end. But Seijudo's defeat has left the Yoshioka school in chaos. Their master defeated by an unknown wandering samurai. This is a disgrace and cannot go unavenged. So Seijudo's brother, Denshichiro, immediately challenges Musashi to a second duel to restore their family's honor. Musashi agrees and again leaves Denshichiro waiting for hours at their agreed upon location. When Musashi arrives, Denshichiro is enraged and attacks him immediately with a 5-foot-long wooden sword. Musashi catches the blade and rips it from Denshichiro's hands. He then beats him to death with his own weapon and walks away. At this point, Musashi has completely destroyed the reputation of the Yoshioka. The legendary family is now forced to install a 12-year-old, Seijudo's son named Mateshichiro, as the head of their school. After all the damage he's done, Musashi cannot be allowed to leave Kyoto alive. A third and final duel is offered to Musashi to be held at the Ichijoji Temple under the famous Sagarimatsu pine tree. Mateshichiro, the 12-year-old, will be the one to take down Musashi. When he receives the invitation, Musashi has his doubts. I mean, he just bodied their two best swordsmen, and now they want him to fight a 12-year-old? So instead of his normal strategy of arriving late to throw off his opponent, he arrives early and hides behind a tree. His suspicions are soon proven correct, as the remaining Yoshioka family and their students arrive with a company of men armed with bows and Tanegashima rifles. There was never going to be a duel. The Yoshioka were planning to kill Musashi in an ambush. But before the Yoshioka can take their positions, Musashi jumps out and shouts, "Musashi waits for you!" and slices through the 12-year-old boy, instantly ending the Yoshioka school for good. The Yoshioka watch in horror as their young master falls to the ground. Their shock is quickly replaced by anger, and they raise their weapons and close in on Musashi. First, the students attack and try to take him down, but they're no match for the wandering swordsmen and are quickly struck down. The archers begin firing, and Musashi's sleeve is shot with an arrow. He then draws his second sword and engages the mob single-handedly. Like a predator chasing wild game, the men scatter as Musashi rushes them. Anyone who confronts him is cut down. The Yoshioka swordsmen have never faced anyone who fights in this barbaric style, and they can't keep up with the speed of Musashi's two blades. Musashi cuts down 10 more men before the rest of the disciples flee the battle. News of the destruction of the prestigious Yoshioka school spreads throughout Japan, and the legend of Miyamoto Musashi and his two-sword fighting style is officially born. Number 3. The Combat of 30. It's April 30th, 1341, and Duke John III of Brittany is lying on his deathbed. Surrounding him, his closest family and allies are all deeply troubled. See, John never had any children, and there's a lot of confusion on who's supposed to take his place as ruler. They ask him over and over again, "Who will rule after you are gone? Who?" John coughs and turns, and the people around grow silent. "Shh, he's gonna say something."
For God's sake, leave me alone and do not trouble my spirit with such things.
And then he dies. John dying without declaring an heir to the throne was a huge mistake and led to two of his relatives, his half-brother Jean de Montfort and the husband of his niece Charles of Blois, both claiming to be the rightful heir. And this family feud quickly spirals into what would become known as the Breton War of Succession. The English and the French both see what's happening in Brittany, and having just started their own 100 Years' War a few years earlier, they quickly begin to meddle and turn the War of Succession into a proxy war, with the French backing Charles of Blois and the English backing Jean de Montfort. After a few years of intense fighting, the Pope comes in and negotiates a temporary peace between all parties in Brittany, and it's during this Pope-induced timeout that one of the most brutal brawls in human history began. See, there are these two areas in Brittany, Josselin, commanded by a Breton knight named Jean de Beaumanoir, and Pluimel, controlled by English knight Robert Bemborough. These towns are only 8 miles apart, so the French-backed forces regularly clash with the English during the war. But now that war is in a timeout, and these knights are getting restless. Without fighting, they can't show off how chivalrous they are, and if they can't show off how chivalrous they are, how are they supposed to get famous in Bagahati? So one day, Beaumanoir travels to Pluimel, and from outside the castle gates shouts to Bembaro, challenging him to a duel. It would be a good chance to up our honor, at least for whoever wins, of course. Bembaro thinks and issues a counteroffer. Rather than a duel, let us have a tournament. Take 20 to 30 of your men and I'll do the same, and we'll meet at a beautiful field where nobody disturbs us. No prize money, just the opportunity to fight to the death to prove who were the greatest knights of Christ. You son of a bitch. I'm in. This sounded epic to Beaumanoir, so he accepts the challenge. The rules for their display of chivalry are set. Each side will have 30 men, and they'll fight each other without any reinforcements until one side's warriors are all dead, disabled, or captured. Most importantly, nobody's allowed to run away. And with that, the two men go about recruiting their teams. Beaumanoir recruits a mixture of knights and squires from Brittany, who all support France, and Bembaro's team consists of English knights, German mercenaries, and a handful of Bretons who support the English rule. So on March 26, 1351, both sides each attended Mass and went to confession to absolve their souls. Now that they can beat the shit out of each other without worrying about going to hell, Beaumanoir and Bembaro march their warriors to a midpoint between their fortresses called Half Oak, bringing with them a throng of spectators and refreshments. The combatants choose their weapons: axes, spears, hammers, and swords, and all the participants mount their horses and form two lines facing each other. A signal is given and both sides charge full speed at each other. The crowd erupts as the two lines meet, and the deafening clang of weapons on armor echoes throughout the field. Some men are knocked off their horses and are quickly met with a warrior from the opposite team frantically swinging their weapon at them, trying to kill them. All the men eventually find themselves on the ground, squared up in pairs, and 30 simultaneous savage duels begin. The fighting is dirty and barbaric, with blood and mud being thrown everywhere. The women in the crowd start to get grossed out. Is this what chivalry is supposed to look like? A French warrior is slain and is quickly followed by two on the English side. After an hour or so, everyone's dirty and exhausted, and someone calls for a timeout. Both sides agree, and both teams go back to their side of the field to repair their armor and weapons, bandage their wounds, and get some refreshments. Eventually, the combatants, still bleeding, battered, and bruised, take the field again and charge at one another. A French squire squares up against Bembaro and thrusts his spear through his head. Bembaro, mortally wounded but unaware of just how bad he looks, tries to stand, and another French knight rushes in and slices him with an axe, killing him on the spot. With Bembaro down, a mercenary on the English team takes command and they regroup and fight back fiercely. Beaumanoir is injured in the English rally and is thrown to the ground. He begs for water, and a knight near him shouts, "Drink your blood, Beaumanoir, your thirst will pass." Exhausted again, the two sides call for another timeout and retreat to their corners of the field. The break doesn't do much to recharge the batteries of the combatants. At this point, they've been fighting to the death in full armor for hours, and they're all completely gassed. On top of this, most of the crowd is either grossed out, bored, or walking away. Remember, there's no big payday for all of this. This is all to prove who's the most chivalrous here. They lurch back onto the battlefield, now clinching and trying to stab each other with daggers and swords. Men are sloppily falling to the ground in exhaustion. It's at this point a French knight decides that the rules of this match are stupid, and he wants to go home, and he gets on his horse and rides onto the battlefield. He charges straight into the biggest pile of people and steamrolls 5 English knights, which collapses their line. The French team swarms in, and soon the remaining English warriors surrender. 9 of the English team's warriors and 5 on the French team lie dead on the battlefield. Everyone else is severely injured with broken bones and deep lacerations. The remaining English team is brought back to Josselin and held for a small ransom. Surprisingly, the survivors of the combat of the 30 all did in the end get what they wanted, as the story of their brawl quickly spread throughout Europe. Many were treated as celebrities after the fight, and one even went on to marry a princess. So I guess it all worked out. Except, the French side kinda cheated. It's medieval Japan, and you're born in 1584 in a small village named Miyamoto. Being born in Miyamoto and all, your mom obviously gives you the name Benosuke. Wait, what? You don't know who your dad is, and unfortunately you won't know your mom either because she passes away during childbirth. Luckily, she'd remarried a guy named Shinmen Munisai, and he's gonna be your dad. Muni is like the perfect blend of supremely skilled swordsman and supremely abusive stepfather. You don't really like him, and you get into a ton of fights with him until he kicks you out of the house when you're 6. You go to live with your uncle, who's pretty chill because he's a Buddhist. So you live with your uncle for a few years and you're 12 now, and one day you're walking around the town and you see a poster that catches your eye. It's an open challenge for a sword duel from a guy named Arima Kihei. He's looking to test his skill against anyone who's brave enough to face him. You grab a long stick, find him, and tell him you're down to duel, and he accepts. The duel begins and Arima draws his blade. You circle him with your stick and he charges at you. You swing your stick with all your might and you knock his sword to the ground. He looks at you with a mixture of confusion and fear in his eyes, and on instinct, you quickly strike his head and he collapses to the ground. You just won your first duel! Hooray! Oh, wait, he's still alive. Alright, that'll do it. Now you just won your first duel. Hooray! Dueling is pretty fun, but your uncle didn't really like you fighting and wants you to avoid violence and seek enlightenment. Your uncle is cool, so you listen to him. Until this guy named Tadashima Akiyama challenges you to a duel when you're 15, and you go and kill him too. You decide that your life is probably not going to be the one your uncle wished for you, and so you change your name to Miyamoto Musashi and leave his home to go on a quest to become a great warrior. Puberty is hitting you hard now, and you shoot up to 6 feet tall, about a foot taller than everyone else around you. You're bigger and stronger than almost everyone you know, and just in time too, as it seems the 100-year warring states period called the Sengoku Jidai is just about wrapping up. Everyone is choosing sides for the final battle between Tokugawa Ieyasu and Ishida Mitsunari, who is subbing in for Toyotomi Hideyori because he's still a kid. You and your stepdad Munisai, who you're kinda cool with now, side with the eventual winner Tokugawa, and you fight in some minor battles for him, but completely miss the main event, which was the Battle of Sekigahara. Hundreds of years later, some guy who's writing a book about you will think this is too boring, so he'll say that you fought in that big battle for the losing side, which made you a Ronin. And this will then make people living 100 years later get upset when a stickman with glasses on YouTube says that you didn't fight in Sekigahara. So upset that they'll have to write a comment to tell that stickman he's wrong. So you manage to survive the end of the Sengoku Jidai, but you still want to fight people, so you begin wandering the country again looking for opponents. As you're wandering, you remember that your stepdad Munisai had kind of become famous by beating the headmaster of a legendary fencing school in Kyoto. So you decide to travel there and challenge them as well. You're 20 now and arrive in Kyoto in 1604. You find the school, which was run by the Yoshioka family, and you challenge the headmaster to a duel. The head of the school is this guy Yoshioka Sejuro, and he remembers your stepdad beating their headmaster and wants revenge. He agrees to a duel with wooden swords and gives you the time and place to meet. He seems pretty angry for some reason, and this makes you think, you know what would be funny if he gets even angrier? So when the time of your duel comes, you don't show up on time. You make him wait for hours. And when you do finally get there, you look at his face and he's fuming. As soon as he sees you, he charges at you, blinded by rage caused by your disrespect. You quickly ready your wooden sword, and as he approaches, you strike his shoulder, breaking it. Hooray! Another duel won! His students carry him away, and after he recovers, he quits swordsmanship and becomes a monk. You're feeling pretty good now, having proven that you're just as good as your stepdad, and you're ready to leave Kyoto. But the Yoshioka family feels shame and dishonor, and they want revenge. Seijuro's brother, a man named Denshichiro, challenges you to a duel, which you accept. You show up to the duel and body Denshichiro with one strike to the head. Whoops, a little too hard, and now he's dead. The Yoshioka school is now falling apart because you just took out 2 of their best swordsmen. The only guy they got left is a 12-year-old boy named Mateshichiro, who they named their headmaster. The school sends you another challenge. They want you to duel this 12-year-old boy. You remember that you killed a guy at 12, so maybe they're serious. But at the same time, something doesn't feel right. So this time, instead of showing up late, you show up early and hide behind a tree. Your gut instincts were right, and the Yoshioka show up with a mob of students armed with bows, swords, and spears. This wasn't a duel, this was an ambush. You wait until they all get into place to wait to ambush you, and then you jump out and slice the 12-year-old boy in half before anyone can do anything. Nice! But it's kinda awkward for a second, then the rest of the school starts charging you. You fight them off and make it out of the city alive. You just destroyed one of the most prestigious fencing schools in Japan. Hey, you're kind of famous now. After leaving Kyoto, you hear there's a Buddhist monk who's a master at fighting with a spear somewhere nearby. You want to see how well you can do fighting against someone like that, so you travel to Nara and you find him, but the guy's like 81 years old, so he makes you fight one of his disciples, a guy named Okuzondoi instead. Unlike the Yoshioka, who were angry all the time for some reason, these Buddhist monks are cool. You win a friendly duel, but nobody dies, and everybody's pretty chill after. You leave Nara and wander around a bit more, and you somehow reconnect with your stepdad Munisai. You're both adults now, and he sees you're pretty good at fighting. He thinks maybe he misjudged you when you were a kid, and trains you in the weird fighting style he had developed using a sword and jite at the same time. You take this teaching and apply it to your own two-sword style of fighting that you've been trying to figure out. You're 23 now, and you wander into the Mie Prefecture, and you get challenged to a duel by a guy named Shishido. He's a samurai too, but his preferred weapon is a kusarigama, which is a sickle with a heavy chain attached to it. Seems interesting, so you agree to fight. The duel begins, and Shishido is attacking you from long range with his chain. You realize he's trying to wrap it around your sword so he can disarm you. If he does that, he'll charge in and cut you up with the sickle, so you watch for a pattern in his movement. Your ultra instincts kick in and you see his attack pattern. When he launches his chain at you again, you rush in and slice his chest, killing him instantly. Another win! You're pretty good at this dueling thing. But all this winning is making you more and more famous, and that makes stronger and stronger opponents start to seek you out to make a name for themselves. The first guy who comes for you is a man named Muso Gonosuke. He's an arrogant warrior who, like you, has been on a quest dueling the strongest people he can find. He's exceptionally skilled at fighting with a bow staff. He attacks you without warning, and you block his strike with the new technique you named the Jujidome, and you disarm him. He freaks out and runs away to a Shinto monastery to figure out what he did wrong. Thinking about how you were able to beat him, he develops a new style of fighting using a shorter staff called a jo. He finds you again, and this time the match is a lot tougher. Too close to call, maybe. You say it ends in a draw, but Muso tells everyone he won, and he trademarks his style of fighting as Shinto Musu Ryu. His main marketing for his school is that he beat you in a duel, and just off of this, his school lasts for centuries. Next, you fight two guys at once in Edo and beat them. This makes you even more famous, and you finally draw the attention of the greatest swordsman in the country, a man named Sasaki Kojiro. You're sent an invitation to duel Sasaki Kojiro on an island named Funajima on April 13, 1612. Sasaki is a huge man who uses a long sword called an odachi. He's probably the biggest guy you've ever gone up against, and he's said to be the best swordsman in the land. You realize that this is probably going to be the toughest opponent you've ever faced, and it's very likely that one of you will not leave the island alive. You need to take this seriously, and so you come up with a plan to stack the deck in your favor as much as possible. On the day of the duel, you wait until the sun is high in the sky, then start heading towards the island. You get on a boat and tell the oarsman to take his time getting you there. You grab one of his spare oars and begin carving it into the shape of a sword. As the sun is beginning to set, you finally tell the oarsman to bring you to shore and you spot Kojiro. Boy, does he look upset! You get off the boat and he rushes to you on the shore. He's fuming and spit is flying out of his mouth as he talks. He then takes a look at the boat oar you've been carving. He seems even more mad now, and he unsheaths his sword and throws the sheath to the ground. I guess he's ready to fight. You smile and say, "You've already lost. A samurai who throws away his scabbard has no intention of leaving alive." He charges at you with his signature swallow cut, and he slices the headband off your head. Yikes! Close call! You jump back and position yourself with the setting sun to your back. You see him squinting, trying to track you against the blinding light. As he struggles to see you, you see your opening and lunge towards him and hit him square on the head with your boat oar sword. He falls to the ground, dead. Uh-oh, his students look pretty pissed. Better get out of there right away. Someone should probably change the name of this island now, by the way, because that fight is probably one people are gonna want to remember. Ah, much better. Everyone finds out you beat Sasaki Kojiro, and you're famous now. The best in all the land, people say, and so you decide to parlay that fame into your own fencing school. Turns out running a school sucks, so you shut it down, and then for the next 20 years, you find work doing random jobs for various lords. You're a construction supervisor for a bit, then you go fight for the shogun to quell some rebellions. You also adopt some kids. One commits seppuku, and that makes you pretty sad. You fight in a couple more duels along the way, but by now nobody wants to use real swords anymore. You've earned your GOAT status. Your kill count caps out at 61 kills in duels. Time flies when you're doing all kinds of random things, and suddenly you're 48 and now living in Kumamoto. You finally find your true passion. Turns out it wasn't fighting at all, it was painting and poetry. But you still gotta do some work putting down another rebellion for the lord you're working for when you're 53. Someone throws a rock at you which knocks you off your horse. That sucks. So you go back to writing and painting again. You write a martial arts and military strategy document called the Hyoho Sanjugo. You try to pass on as much of your accumulated knowledge of over 40 years of fighting for future generations of warriors. What's this weird feeling in your hands? Oh god, now it's burning everywhere. Surprise, you got neuralgia, and the pain is debilitating. You move from the life of luxury serving a lord into a cave called Regondo, and you live alone. You begin to write your final masterpiece, the Gorin no Sho, or the Book of Five Rings. This is your final master brain dump. Everything you've learned about becoming the greatest swordsman in history committed to paper. In this work, you explain your philosophies on martial arts training, on the fundamentals of your now famous two-sword style, the psychology of battle, your diss tracks on other martial arts styles, and finally your thoughts on Zen and consciousness. If you know the way broadly, you will see it in all things you write. And famous podcasters will get tattoos of you on their arms and quote this line over and over again to millions of people. You finish the Book of Five Rings and give it and the rest of your worldly possessions to your most loyal disciple. You're 61, and now you have lung cancer. On June 13, 1645, sensing your time is near, you take a final bath, maybe the only bath you ever took in your adult life actually, and dress in your finest clothes. You tighten your belt and insert your wakizashi. You seat your frail body on the ground, pull one knee to your chest, and stare out of the cave. In one hand, you hold your katana, and in your other, your cane, and you peacefully pass away sitting this way, quietly observing the beauty and order of the world. You're born to an aristocratic family in Brussels in 1880, and your parents named you Adrian Carton DiWiart. Your mom's Irish, and your dad's a powerful Belgian lawyer and diplomat. Or at least that's what your mom says. There's a lot of rumors going around that your real dad was actually King Leopold II, the King of Belgium. Not really someone you'd want to be related to anyway. Your mom dies when you're 6, so nobody finds out if that's true or not. Your father remarries, and he and his new wife decide the best thing for you would be to study law in England. Your dad really wants you to follow in his footsteps, and he chooses a prestigious boarding school in Oxford. So you go and try to make your dad happy. But while at school, you start to learn about war, and it sounds amazing! So amazing, in fact, you decide that you're going to go to war as soon as you can. You finally get your chance when war breaks out in South Africa in the Second Boer War. Just one problem. You're only 19, and the age requirement to enlist is 20. Not to mention, you're not actually British. No matter, you make up a fake name, Trooper Carton. Say you're 25 and submit your application. If the British don't take you, you'll go fight for the Boers instead. The British don't run a background check, and you're off to South Africa to fight for Team Britain. Actual war is so much more intense than the teachers made it seem. Trenches, mud, barbed wire, explosions, people dying everywhere. It's everything you hoped it would be. You notice that the enemy has set up barbed wire that's preventing your allies from advancing, so you go to your colonel and ask for permission to run up and move the barbed wire out of the way. He calls you a fool and says no. Super lame. But you soon learn why he called you that when Boer snipers shoot you in the stomach and groin. These injuries send you to the medics, who discover your real identity, and you're shipped back to Oxford as soon as you're healed. Back in Oxford, all of your classmates think you're super cool and a hero, but you're depressed that your war experience was dull with no glory. You stay in the British Army and are deployed to India, where it's super boring. You spend most of your time getting jacked and hunting. After serving the crown for 8 years, you finally become a British citizen. In 1914, you're really itching to get back to war, so you go ahead and sign up to get shipped out to British Somaliland. You're gonna get to ride a camel and fight some guy they're calling the Mad Mullah. You're super excited. But as you're on the way to Africa, the absolute worst thing that you could ever imagine happens. The Great War breaks out, and Britain declares war on Germany. The other soldiers are gonna get to fight the best army in Europe, and you're stuck on a boat, heading to Africa where you'll be riding a camel and fighting this mad mullah guy. Ugh. You decide to make the most of it and rush out to the front lines to fight the dervishes. They're pretty aggro, and maybe fighting here isn't all that bad. You sneak up on the enemy, so close that you can touch them with your walking stick, and they see you and begin shooting at you. You get shot twice in the face and get hit in the eye and the ear. You get shipped back to England, and your eye is so messed up, they can't save it, and it's removed. This actually worked out really well, because now you can ask to go fight in the Great War. The front lines in Europe really need experienced officers just like you. But there's a problem. They don't want to send a guy with an eye patch to the front lines because they think it'll make the army look weak. They say they'll let you go if you wear a glass eye. You agree and sign the papers to get yourself deployed. On the way home, you remove your glass eye and toss it out the window of your taxi and put on a black eye patch instead. You're sent off to France to fight in the Great War, and boy, this one is even more intense. Trenches, barbed wire, artillery shells exploding all over the place. Oh, it's everything you hoped it would be. You wander up to the front lines, and everyone keeps telling you to duck for some reason. How are you supposed to see all the explosions if you keep ducking? Your second in command comes up and tells you, "I really wish you would duck when those shells come." Just before you can answer, another shell comes and knocks you both off your feet. You stand up, dust yourself off, and see a hand next to you. That glove looks familiar. Ooh, that's not good. You march your men forward through the trenches and find some dead German bodies on the road ahead. It looks pretty suspicious, so you and your men go to investigate. Aha! Just as you expected! A trap! And now they're shooting at you! You get knocked to the ground, and when you try to push yourself up, your left hand isn't working right. Ooh, that's not good. Your palm is completely shot through, and your fingers are barely hanging on, only attached by some skin. And the worst part? You decided for the first time ever to wear a wristwatch that day. Well, now that watch is blown to bits and embedded in your arm. You run and make it back to the medical tent and ask the doctors to pull off your fingers. They tell you no and say it would be too dangerous. Oh my God! For the next few years, surgeons try to save what's left of your hand, and eventually you get sick of them failing, so you ask them to just cut it off. So now you got one eye and one hand, and you get yourself back into the trenches. You find yourself at the Battle of the Somme. Over 1 million soldiers will die in this battle, and you're right in the thick of it leading the charge. On July 3rd, 1916, you lead your division to attack La Boisselle, one of the strongest German-held positions. The offensive is brutal, but you're leading your men well, firing at the enemy, pulling grenade pins with your teeth, and encouraging your troops. By night, all of your fellow commanding officers are dead or wounded. Out of nowhere, you're suddenly knocked to the ground, and you quickly check yourself for wounds. Hand? Check. Eye? Check. Head? Uh-oh. The back of your head has been blown off by a machine gun bullet, but luckily, it missed all the vital parts. Okay, alright, seriously, what does that even mean? You spend 3 weeks in the hospital for this one, but while there, you receive the prestigious Victoria Cross for your efforts at the Somme. This just makes you want to go fight some more, so as soon as you can, you're right back in the thick of things. First at the Battle of Passchendaele, where artillery fire catches you on the hip, blowing off your clothes. Next at the Battle of Cambrai, where you're shot in the leg and almost lose it. And then at the Battle of Arras, where you get shot in your other ear. By this point, the generals and the doctors are all urging you to stop going back out to the front lines. But what do they know? In another one of your medical stays, you're lying in a stretcher, upset with yourself at just how quickly you found yourself back in the hospital, and a clergyman making his rounds spots your sour face. He approaches you, observes your eye patch, and tells you, "Cheer up, it could have been much worse. A few months ago, I saw a man come through here who was missing both an eye and an arm." You ask him to tell you the name of this soldier, and the clergyman replies, "General Carton DiWiart." What? The war ends, and you find life pretty boring back in England. So you move to Poland, where literally every one of their neighbors are trying to destroy them. You get to fight against the Soviets, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, the Czechs. It's everything you hoped for. While living in Poland, you try air travel and end up in an airplane crash, but survive. You decide to take a train instead on your next diplomatic mission, but your train is attacked by Cossacks, and you have to fire at them while hanging off the back of the train. You fall off and quickly scramble back on, all the while continuing to shoot at them till they disappear. Poland is nice, and you retire and spend the next 16 years there hunting every single day. Life is good. Until a failed Austrian painter starts another massive war in Europe. Poland is quickly invaded by both the Soviets and the Germans, and you barely make it out of there alive. You eventually make it back to Britain, and at 60 years old, you're given your old rank and sent out to fight the Germans in Norway. Your mission is to take Trondheim, but the situation is horrible. In your opinion, the Allied soldiers in this war are nothing compared to the ones that fought in the first one, and the Germans are kicking your ass. Eventually, your unit is pulled back, and you end up in North Ireland. You think your military career is over, until you get selected for a special diplomatic mission to Yugoslavia. You board a plane in Cairo and set off for Belgrade, hoping that this plane doesn't crash this time. Your plane crashes off the coast of Italian-controlled Libya, and when you swim to shore, you're quickly arrested. You're identified as a valuable prisoner and moved to Italy, where you remain captive for 3 years. You attempt to escape 5 times, and on the last attempt actually make it out and spend 8 days in northern Italy disguised as a civilian who spoke no Italian and had an eye patch and was missing his hand. Di giorno. You're recaptured again, and eventually Italy wants out of the war. They use you as a bargaining chip with the British and offer to dress you in a fine Italian suit. You tell your captors you won't object to free clothes, as long as they don't make you look like a gigolo. You get sent back to Britain, and shortly after, your good friend Winston Churchill asks you to be his representative in China. You fly there, this time without crashing, and you quickly take a liking to the Chinese people. Though there's one person in particular you're not too fond of. This guy Mao Zedong seems to love communism, and you do not like it one bit. In a dinner where he's giving a speech, you interrupt him and tell him he's wrong and that he should spend less time yapping and more time attacking the Japanese. Mao, startled, looks at you for a bit, then laughs. Japan finally surrenders in 1945, and you participate in the formal surrender ceremonies as one of the representatives for Britain. As the war's over, you finally retire for good at the age of 67. On your way back home, you make a stop in French Indochina and slip on a coconut mat, breaking a few ribs and knocking yourself unconscious. Luckily, you survived because that would have been a terrible way to go considering everything else you'd gone through. You retire to Ireland and write your memoir and eventually pass away peacefully at the old age of 83. In your autobiography, you reminisce on your time in the Great War and write, "Frankly, I enjoyed the war." It's the year 336 BCE, and on the verge of his greatest conquest, Philip II, the King of Macedonia, is unexpectedly assassinated by one of his most trusted bodyguards. His 20-year-old son inherits not only his conquered lands, but also the most powerful military in the world. Though many at the time doubted the young king, he soon proved to not only be a worthy successor to his father's throne, but also one of, if not the greatest general in the history of mankind. He passes away at the young age of 32, but generations of historians and orators tell tales of his conquests. His bravery and victories against all odds are legendary, and they gave him the name Alexander the Great. But here's the thing about great men in history. Oftentimes, two things can be true at once. Alexander the Great was no doubt one of the most brilliant military minds of all time, but he was also a raging alcoholic, and like other goats, he had a huge chip on his shoulder, and this made him take things very, very personally. Like this time, for example. Number 1. The destruction of Thebes. Shortly after Alexander inherited King Philip's throne, many of the lands his father had conquered began to rebel. Alexander wasted no time traveling to crush these rebellions, but back in Greece, conquered city-states began to wonder if they too could regain their independence from the Macedonians. Cities like Athens dipped their toes into the inviting pool of independence, but no one in Greece shot their shot harder than the people of Thebes. See, the Thebans saw Philip's death as their chance to finally regain their freedom. Philip was a scary dude, but his son? He was only 20, young and untested. If there was ever a time to fight back, it's now. They begin sending out passionate calls for help to other Greek cities, trying to rally a united Greek army to drive out the Macedonians. The Thebans then started killing or arresting any Macedonian supporters they could find in their city and began stockpiling weapons. While away handling his business up north, Alexander hears what the Thebans are up to and makes a beeline back to Greece, covering an incredible distance in just 13 days. And so, on a morning in early September of 335 BCE, the Thebans are shocked to find Alexander and his army positioned right outside of their city walls. Initially, Alexander tried to be reasonable. "Okay guys, I know all of you can't be guilty, so just hand over the troublemakers and we're good." "Okay, sure, we'll give them all up as soon as you hand yourself over to us, you fucking barbarian."
Sick bird, bro.
"Look at me, I'm Philip." Kill them all. Now, back in this day, aside from a few notable exceptions, Greek city-states were generally left unharmed during wars. Thebes in particular had existed for over 1,500 years, but Alexander orders his men to siege the city. The Thebans remained inside the city walls, confident that they had a good shot at pulling off this upset. See, when Alexander was away, they secretly made a pact with Athens to work together to fight against the Macedonians. But when Alexander showed up in Greece, the Athenians got cold feet and ghosted, leaving the Thebans to fight all alone. Realizing the Athenians were not coming to their rescue, the Thebans decide to march out of the city and fight Alexander head-on before they're weakened by starvation. Fighting not only for their freedom, but for the lives of their wives and children inside the city, the Thebans go toe-to-toe against the mighty Macedonian army. No one is able to gain an edge, and the stalemate drags on, until Alexander learns of an undefended gate. He sends a unit into the city, and when the Thebans learn that their loved ones are being terrorized, they break formation and are forced to retreat to fight within the city. The famous Theban cavalry made their last stand in the agora, but by sunset, the plaza's fountains ran red with blood. The survivors, men, women, and children, were herded like cattle into holding pens. And here, Alexander, calmed down a bit but not really, tries to be diplomatic. He assembles representatives from the smaller Greek cities surrounding Thebes to vote on the fate of the city and its people. But here's the thing, the Thebans had bullied these smaller cities around them for centuries, so unsurprisingly they all vote for Alexander to tear it all down. The Macedonian army sweeps through the streets of Thebes. Block by block, house by house, they tore the city apart. Soldiers systematically moved through the neighborhoods with torches, creating fires so intense that the marble buildings cracked and exploded, and the great walls, which had stood for centuries, were pulled down stone by stone until they were nothing but rubble. Merchants from as far as Carthage and Egypt arrived within days, and every one of the 30,000 surviving citizens of Thebes were sold off into slavery. Other Greek cities like Athens looked at the smoking ruins of Thebes and are horrified at the total destruction of the once great city. They all find their loyalty real quick, and Alexander's now free to carry out his father's mission of conquering Persia. Number 2. Clitus the Black. It's 334 BCE, and Alexander's leading his first major invasion into Achaemenid Persian territory, and at the Battle of Granicus, the fighting is intense. Alexander, as always, is leading from the front lines. With his white-plumed helmet, he's easy to spot, which you would think would make him an easy target, but he's a fierce and skilled warrior, and strikes down soldier after soldier who dares to engage him. But after thrusting his blade into the next unlucky Persian NPC, his sword gets stuck, lodged in the dead man's armor. While struggling to remove his sword, a Persian commander sees his opening and charges at Alexander from behind, swinging his axe with evil intent. Just as the axe was about to cleave Alexander's head into two, one of his father's trusted generals, a man named Clitus the Black, thrusts his spear through the Persian's chest, saving the young king's life just in the nick of time. The would-be killer topples sideways into the bloody river, his axe falling harmlessly beside him. After saving his life, Clitus becomes one of Alexander's most trusted commanders and was known for two things: his unwavering loyalty and his brutal honesty. While Alexander's court was filled with yes-men who would kiss his ass all day long, Clitus was different. He'd tell Alexander exactly what he thought, and Alexander actually respected this about him, at least until he didn't. See, in 328 BCE, Alexander's in Maracanda, modern-day Samarkand in Uzbekistan. He's already conquered half the known world, and as a thank you to Clitus, he rewards him by making him the satrap of an area called Bactria. Now, being a satrap wasn't some minor position. It meant you were basically a governor of an entire region. But Clitus wasn't happy about this quote-unquote promotion. He saw this as exactly the opposite, as he would be far away from the king and be forgotten. On top of this, the Macedonian veterans who had followed Alexander across the world watched as their king slowly transforms into something they didn't recognize. As he conquered Persian lands, Alexander began to adopt Persian customs, wear Persian clothes, and act more like a Persian king than a Macedonian one. To old-school Macedonians like Clitus, this was repulsive, and the growing resentment of all this Persian bullshit and the humiliating new assignment explodes at a feast in 328 BCE. The feast at Marconda started like any other. Wine flowed freely, and as usual, Alexander began bragging and praising his own achievements, comparing himself to heroes like Hercules, and talking about how he's already done more than his father Philip ever did. The room filled with the sounds of yes-men clapping and nodding along to every word, while Clitus quietly attempts to drink his resentment away. And it's at this point Alexander announces he has new assignments for his most loyal of generals. "Clitus, my friend, you are to take these defeated Greek mercenaries who we just beat and go to fight, I don't know, like those annoying nomads on the steppe or something, I guess." This assignment was the ultimate insult to Clitus. He had saved Alexander's life, served him and his father loyally, and now he was being banished to the steppe with a bunch of Greek losers? His pride could take no further injury, and he stands and shouts, "Are these the words of the son of Zeus? Every victory was won by Macedonian blood. But look at you. You dress like a Persian." Holy shit. The room goes dead silent. Even drunk, everyone knows this is bad, and Alexander's face boils red. Clitus continues to pop off, bringing up Alexander's dad and how ashamed he would be, and then complaining about his assignment, each word more bitter than the last. Alexander's now so pissed, he grabs an apple from the table and throws it at Clitus's head. He begins to storm towards Alexander, ready to fight. The other officers restrain him and drag him from the hall, kicking and screaming, his voice trailing off as he's carried away. Crisis averted, Alexander's given a brief moment to collect himself. Okay, now, before I was so rudely interrupted, you, my dear friend Perdiccas, you will— And one more thing. Your dad was way cooler than you. Yeah, boy! That's it. Alexander grabs a spear from one of his guards, and before anyone could react, he drives it through Clitus's heart, killing him instantly. The second Clitus hits the ground, Alexander sobers up real quick. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander stood there, watching his friend's blood pool on the floor. The man who had saved his life at Granicus, who had served him faithfully for years, was dead by his own hand. He tries to turn the spear on himself, but his guards stop him, and for 3 days he stays in his tent, refusing to eat or drink, crying and screaming that he's become a murderer like the barbarians he conquered. The ancient sources tell us Alexander deeply regretted killing Clitus, but the damage to his reputation as a fair and balanced ruler was done, and regret couldn't bring back his dearest friend. Number 3, the Tyre Land Bridge. It's 332 BCE, and at this point, Alexander was basically unstoppable. In just 2 years, he'd steamrolled through Asia Minor, crushed the Persians at Granicus and Issus, and turned the entire Mediterranean coastline into Macedonian territory. Well, almost the entire coastline, I guess, except for a city called Tyre. See, Tyre was a heavily fortified island fortress half a mile offshore of modern-day Lebanon, and they politely told him to f*** off. Protected by 150-foot walls and the Mediterranean Sea itself, Tyre had never fallen to siege in its entire history. When Alexander rolled up on the city, he said he wished to leave an offering at the temple of Melkart that he'd heard was there. The Tyrians refused, and this turned out to be a huge mistake, because you see, Alexander was a huge Hercules fanboy, and Melkart, he had heard, was the Phoenician equivalent of Hercules. Being denied an opportunity to fanboy out was insulting. Alexander took this no very, very personally. So he decided Tyre needed to be taught a lesson, which led him to going full Minecraft. Alexander ordered his men to build a massive land bridge of stone and sand straight through the sea to reach the island. The Tyrians watched from their walls, at first laughing at a distance as they watched Alexander's army hopelessly dumping sand and stone into the ocean, but they soon started freaking out as Alexander's bridge got closer and closer. At a certain point, the people in Tyre realized that this lunatic might actually reach them, so they sent divers to mess with the bridge's foundations and launched counterattacks from their walls. They loaded up old horse transport ships with cedar wood, pitch, sulfur, and whatever else would burn, setting them on fire and sending them straight into Alexander's construction project. As hard as they tried, nothing seemed to work, and the bridge got closer and closer every day. But just as Alexander's bridge was nearly complete, nature itself seemed to join Tyre's side. A storm hit and destroyed a large part of the bridge. Then a whale, not making this up, got stuck in the construction debris and caused delays. But even nature could not defeat Alexander, and he rebuilt the bridge, made it wider, and added wooden towers with giant crossbows on top. Before long, his half-mile bridge to Tyre was complete. The bridge took 8 months to finish, and Alexander's patience had run out. When the rams finally cracked the city walls, his men poured through like a tide of vengeance. He ordered his navy to surround the island and sink any ship that tried to flee. The Macedonians enter the city and ruthlessly slaughter 8,000 Tyrians. The survivors soon wished they died in the initial slaughter, as Alexander ordered 2,000 men dragged to the beach and crucified along the shore. The entire surviving population of 30,000 people were then sold into slavery. The only ones spared were those who sought sanctuary in the Temple of Melkart, the same temple Alexander wanted to visit in the first place. Now, building a half-mile land bridge because you felt insulted is pretty insane, but to me, the craziest thing is that this land bridge Alexander built is still there today over 2,000 years later. He literally changed the geography of the Lebanese coast forever because someone told him no. Number 4, Betis. So after Tyre, Alexander steamrolls through the Persian Empire and is heading to Egypt when he hits a speed bump called Gaza. During this time, Gaza was an ancient fortress city perched on a massive hilltop that controlled the only road between Syria and Egypt. By this time, cities in the area had begun to surrender peacefully when they saw Alexander and his army approaching. But Gaza was different. It was commanded by a man named Betis, who had zero intention of letting Alexander just stroll through. See, the Persians stationed at Gaza weren't just ordinary soldiers. They were veterans who'd sworn blood oaths to protect this gateway to Egypt, and whose fathers and grandfathers had held this same wall. "Let the boy king come," they said. "Our ancestors didn't bow to Xerxes himself. We sure as hell won't bow to some Macedonian pup." And of course, Alexander did not like this one bit. And just like the troublemakers at Tyre, the people of Gaza and Betis in particular were about to find out what happens when Alexander the Great feels disrespected. Knowing that Minecraft is now an option, Alexander orders his men to create a giant dirt ramp to breach the walls of Gaza. His men begin hauling dirt and piling it near the city walls, the whole time dodging flaming arrows and boiling oil from the defenders. This went on for months, until a lucky Persian hit Alexander with a bolt that punched through his shield and buried itself in his shoulder, leaving him with one arm but twice the rage. When Alexander's ramp finally topped the walls of Gaza, Alexander led his men into the city. Unafraid, Betis' soldiers charge and meet the invaders head-on. The fighting is intense, hand-to-hand and on every street, but the soldiers of Gaza are ultimately no match for the Macedonian army. Though they know they have no hope of victory, not one soldier surrenders, and they die fighting or are captured. Following the battle, the citizens of the city are gathered and sold into slavery. Betis fights until the end, and he's amazingly captured alive. He's brought to Alexander, but instead of groveling, he stands in silence. By this time, Alexander had become fond of the Persian customs of people bowing to their emperor, and he took this lack of bowing from Betis personally. He's there sneering at Betis as he stands proudly in defiance, but then realizes that this governor of Gaza may help him live out one of his childhood fantasies. See, as we know from Tyre, Alexander liked Hercules, but Achilles was his all-time Greek goat. He slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow and frequently visited Troy to leave offerings at Achilles' tomb. His life goal was to prove to the world he was just as great as his hero. Having read the Iliad countless times, Alexander recalls the climactic battle between Achilles, the champion of Greece, and Hector, the greatest warrior of Troy. The story goes, fueled by rage for the killing of his best friend, Achilles defeats Hector and drags his dead body from a chariot as revenge. Alexander looks at Betis and smiles. He orders his men to get his chariot and then orders bronze rings driven through Betis' ankles, which are then fastened to said chariot. Once preparations are complete, Alexander gets in, looks back at Betis, and cracks the reins. The horses break out into a full-blown charge, and Alexander giddily does laps around the city walls, with Betis being dragged along behind him. The whole time, Alexander's trying his best to look cool, just like Achilles, but he can't really contain his excitement. Guys, look at me! I'm Achilles! Yeah, boy! Alexander had missed one minor detail in his reenactment, though. See, in the Iliad, Hector was already dead when Achilles started dragging him around. Betis, on the other hand, was still alive. Ironic, because the whole point of that story was about the futility of revenge and the importance of mercy. But oh well, Betis was dead by the end of Alexander's bumpy ride, so same ending, I guess. Humans have been fighting with other humans since the beginning of time, and while we've gotten pretty good at offing each other in very creative ways, we didn't start off with bullets. So here are 7 insane ancient weapons that were actually used in combat. Mayan Hornet Bomb. Okay, so we're gonna start with the primitive weapons first, and then work our way towards more advanced stuff. And this first one is right from Mother Nature herself. The Mayan Hornet Bomb was essentially exactly what it sounds like. It was a primitive bomb that contained a swarm of angry hornets that, when released, would viciously sting whoever was near them. Hornets are actually known to kill up to 50 people a year in present-day Japan, so they definitely can be dangerous, and the Mayans figured out how to weaponize these ornery insects to inflict maximum pain on their enemies. You may be now wondering, what's the difference between a bee and a hornet anyway? Aren't bees our friends, pollinating flowers and stuff? Well, size for one thing. Hornets are bigger, and unlike bees who are pretty much vegan, hornets like to eat meat. But probably the biggest difference when it comes to being used as a weapon, bees can only go on kamikaze missions and die when they sting something. Hornets, on the other hand, can shank you with their venom-filled stinger as many times as they want. Now, you can't just pick up a hornet's nest and hold it until you're ready to use it without expecting to become a casualty of war yourself. So the Mayans not only had to figure out how to collect the hornets, but also how to keep them alive and store them safely so they could be used in battle. They would carefully transfer the hornets from their nest to clay pots or gourds using smoke, and then seal them in with wax or clay, leaving holes so the bugs could breathe. When the time for war came, the Mayan warriors would carry these pots and gourds into battle, and right before they would use them, they would shake the bombs to get the hornets really pissed off. Then they would lob the hornet bomb at their enemy. The bomb would break open, and instantly a swarm of angry hornets would fly out and start stinging whoever was near them. The Mayans also used these hornet bombs in booby traps. When defending a position, they would create dummy soldiers with the hornet bomb placed as the decoy's head. They would then dress the dummy with warrior headgear and position them in key locations. When their enemy would charge in and try to club one of these dummies on the head, the gourd would split open and the attacker would be greeted with a face full of angry hornets stinging their eyeballs. Poop. Poop is gross, and I don't think anyone likes being around it. Human waste is something your body is trying to get rid of, and for good reason. Not only does it smell, it's filled with all sorts of bacteria that can make you very sick. So, of course, humans figured out how to use their doo-doo as a primitive bioweapon. Now, you're probably thinking of cavemen slinging shit at each other like monkeys, right? Come on, we're more evolved than that. We can do better. Let's first take a look at the ancient Scythians. They coated their arrows with a poison made of human poop, blood, and viper excrement. When these arrows hit someone, the wound would easily become infected and gangrenous, causing a slow, painful death. In medieval Europe, poop was a strategic resource. Military geniuses like Conrad Kaiser recommended it for both offense and defense, storing the brown stuff in barrels for future use. And when the bubonic plague rolled around, flinging the feces of the afflicted over castle walls was all the rage. And let's not forget ancient China, where they would load up catapults and trebuchets to launch dirty bombs made of poop, hemp string, and gunpowder over castle walls during sieges. Sure, that made a mess. Anyways, poop was also used as a weapon as recently as the Vietnam War. The Viet Cong would coat sharp punji sticks with human feces and place them at the bottom of booby traps, hoping an American GI would fall into them. The GIs would slip and fall into these traps and were pierced by these punji sticks and would suffer horrible infections. Which kinda leads into the next weapon, Guai Jian. Now, this one technically could have been included in the last section, but I think it deserves its own. Guai Jian, or the ghost arrow, was an ancient Chinese weapon and booby trap that was kinda like stepping on Legos that could kill you. While at first glance, they kinda look like toys or pieces from a kid's game, don't let appearances fool you. Guai Jian was an extremely dangerous weapon not just for the victims, but also for the user. These iron caltrops were sharp and were slow cooked in human feces and poison to coat them entirely with dangerous bacteria. After coating, they would be held in specially made bamboo containers to protect the handler. To use them, the soldier would sprinkle the poisonous caltrops on the ground for a foot soldier or horse to step on. They were mainly used to protect flanks or to retreat from battle. Reportedly, they were also used in naval warfare and shot from a distance onto enemy ships. Imagine standing on deck and taking one of those to the neck! Holy shit, I actually hit him! Chinese wolf brush. Speaking of Chinese naval warfare, it's the 16th century and China is having a serious pirate problem. These aren't your average swashbucklers. These are wokwo, a fearsome blend of cultures including Korean but mostly Japanese marauders. They were pillaging and plundering along the Chinese coast using large two-handed swords that could easily chop through wood or bamboo. Bad news for any defender holding a standard issue spear. So how do you counter such a threat? You've got a few options. Option A, a super long spear to poke from a distance. Option B, a shield that could withstand the sword strikes. Or Option C, a bamboo branch.
What?
This was the choice of Qi Jiguan, one of China's greatest military strategists. The wolf brush wasn't just any branch. This was a 13 to 16 feet long shaft made of ultra-hard tortoiseshell bamboo that weighed around 9 pounds. This bamboo was toughened up even more with tung oil and then fire hardened. At the end of the wolf's brush was a spear tip and branches that were intentionally left on the bamboo stalk. Each branch's tip was dipped in a lethal poison. The wolf brush was used mainly in a defensive position known as the Mandarin Duck Formation. Supported by soldiers armed with spears, swords, and shields, the brush holder would thrust the bamboo spear at enemy attackers, trying to prick them with one of the poisonous branches. Say ni hao to my little friend! While it was large and kind of unwieldy, the wolf brush turned out to be extremely effective, as once the people getting hit by the poison branches started passing out, the enemies would try to stay away from it. Some designs were even said to be able to fend off arrows, so it was also good for defense. The wolf brush also required virtually no training, as it was basically just a long stick. You basically just waggled the big bamboo stalk at people's faces and hoped for the best, and it usually worked out. Eventually, the bamboo branches were upgraded to iron branches, which made them even more effective at slicing and poisoning the enemy. Urumi Whip Sword. This one seems like something a kid would come up with when designing their own superhero, but it's real, and it was deadly. Invented in the 11th century in southern India in a region called Kerala, the Urumi whip sword is basically exactly what it sounds like, a cross between a sword and a whip. The Urumi featured a standard sword handle that was connected to one of more flexible metal blades that measured 3 to 5 feet long. Some models had up to 32 blades. The Urumi was used differently than a standard sword. Instead of trying to chop someone's head or arm off with one blow, the user would instead swing the blades around like a whip, trying to slice chunks from their enemy. The flexible blades made it difficult to defend against. If you held up a shield against an Urumi user, chances are the blade would just wrap around it and cut you in the arm. Skilled Urumi users could whip around the blade so quickly they turned into a spinning ball of death. Now, this seems great, until you realize that flexible blades can also flex in your direction. It was just as easy to cut off your toes or chunks of your legs when using it. This is why the Urumi was the last weapon taught to young warriors. Mastering the Urumi was challenging, but if you were able to do so, you would be virtually untouchable on the battlefield. Plus, you look freaking cool when you use it. Tianbing Jian. Okay, this one might be my favorite one on this list. The Tianbing Jian, or Heavenly Soldier Arrow, was a weapon used in ancient China that was essentially a kite loaded with rockets and bombs. The Tianbing Jian was a huge war kite that measured around 9 feet by 4 feet, made of straw and wood. It would be loaded with a rocket pod that contained 100 rocket arrows and a few dozen bombs. The rocket arrows were essentially normal arrows with a bottle rocket strapped to it. When lit, they would fly toward their target at insane speeds. This war kite was mainly used in night raids. A long, slow-burning fuse connected to the rocket pod was lit, and the kite flyer would fly the Tianbing Jian into an enemy fort or behind enemy lines. The goal was to get the kite in position near the sleeping enemy before the fuse reached the rocket pod. Because the kite was flown at night using nothing but the wind, it was silent and could enter into enemy territory completely undetected. The Chinese were the ones who discovered gunpowder, so these war kites were essentially the first bombing raids in human history. There was also another version of this war kite called the Tian Lei Pao, which instead of a rocket box, used a death row convict strapped to the kite armed with rockets and bombs. The convict's job was to fly into enemy territory on the kite and manually launch the rockets and bombs in a kamikaze mission. At least these inmates got to go out with a bang. The Claw of Archimedes. It's the tail end of the 3rd century BCE, and the Second Punic War between Rome and Carthage is causing chaos and collateral damage throughout the Mediterranean. Caught in the middle of this war was one of history's greatest minds in mathematics and engineering, Archimedes, who was living in Syracuse, a city on the island of Sicily. Sicily was a highly valued strategic position for both the Romans and Carthaginians, which made it a prime target for both armies. So in 214 BCE, the Romans arrive at Syracuse and begin a siege. The people of the city turn to Archimedes to come up with a plan, a weapon, anything that could help stop the Romans from invading their city. So, like an old-timey Oppenheimer, Archimedes put his big brain to work and came up with one of the nerdiest weapons of ancient history, the Claw of Archimedes. The Archimedes claw was essentially a giant crane that was mounted onto the city walls. Attached to the crane was a giant hook or claw that was large enough to snag onto Roman ships. When the Romans sailed too close to the wall, the crane's claw would be dropped onto the ship, hoping to hook something on board. Once the claw was secured, the crane would lift the ship into the air, tossing its crew into the water. The ship would then be released, and with luck, it would capsize or be destroyed from the impact and sink to the ocean floor. Archimedes also reportedly created a solar death ray out of mirrors, which focused the sun's energy onto the wooden Roman boats and set them on fire. The Romans became frustrated by the effectiveness of Archimedes' inventions, and orders were sent from top commanders to find and capture him alive once they were in the city. A brilliant mind like Archimedes designing weapons for the Romans was a dream for these generals. Unfortunately for everyone, the Roman soldiers didn't really know what Archimedes looked like. When they finally entered the city, one of the soldiers found an old man studying in his room. The old man rudely told the soldier to get out of his house, and the soldier, annoyed by the disrespect, responded by killing him on the spot. Oops! Turns out that old man was Archimedes, and the Roman general in command of the siege was not very happy that happened. Today, we're going over the greatest rivalry in human history. It's the latter half of the 12th century, and in the fragmented chaos of the Middle East, the Crusaders living in the Holy Land have entered into an uneasy truce with the Muslim rulers in the area. Things are tense for the Christians in this strange world, but thanks to the ceasefire, they're able to live in relative peace while planning their next movements. But everything changes in 1187 when a rogue Crusader prince named Renaud breaks the truce and begins attacking Muslim caravans. This act of unprovoked aggression simply cannot go unpunished, and the Ayyubid Sultan, a man named Saladin, sets a trap for the Crusaders, and he lures them into the Battle of Hattin, where he delivers the most crushing defeat the Christians will ever experience in the Middle East. At Hattin, Saladin executes Renaud himself and captures one of the most holy relics in all of Christianity, a fragment of the true cross, the very cross Jesus was crucified on as his prize. Weeks later, he goes on to recapture Jerusalem, and he begins planning to permanently remove all Christians from the land. Back in Europe, the Pope issues a call for a third crusade to reclaim the Holy City, and kings from the greatest Christian empires begin to take up the cross. Around this time, a young prince named Richard I betrays his father and becomes the King of England. With his throne secured, he joins the crusade and sets his sights on his next glorious conquest, the reclaiming of the true cross and the city of Jerusalem from the Muslims. And so in 1191, Richard and his army set sail for the Middle East. He has no idea that soon he'll be locked in a deadly life-or-death showdown against the most formidable foe he has ever faced. The stage is set for the greatest rivalry in the history of mankind, a legendary warrior king versus a genius tactical strategist. This is the story of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. In 1189, following the fall of Jerusalem, Crusaders in the Holy Land began a siege on the Muslim port city of Acre. The fighting is fierce, with both the Christians and Muslims fully understanding the importance of the city, and momentum swings back and forth daily. Eventually, the Muslim defenders are cut off from their supply lines, and they offer to surrender peacefully, but the Crusaders, hoping for a glorious victory, deny their requests. But the tides of war shift when Saladin arrives with his army. He quickly surrounds the once confident Crusaders, and now they're forced to deal with constant attacks from the city walls in front of them and horse archers sent in by Saladin in their rear. This stagnant double siege situation drags on for a year, and the Crusaders outside the city and the Muslim defenders inside the city begin to starve. The winter of 1190 is brutal, and many of the Christians begin to die from sickness and starvation. It seems the campaign at Acre is headed for failure, and they pray to God to save them. And their prayers are answered in the spring of 1191 when King Philip of France arrives, quickly followed by his frenemy, the newly crowned King Richard of England. Sensing victory is near, the Crusaders celebrate the arrival of the kings, until they see that they're both super sick from their journey and can't fight just yet. While rolling around sick in bed, King Richard sends his first message to Saladin.
Dear Saladin, I, Richard I, King of England, and soon all of France as well, request your presence to discuss your surrender of Acre and our holy city of Jerusalem. Oh, and also, can you, send some fruit, please, because I'm feeling quite ill. Thanks!
What the fuck? Saladin sends the fruit, but he rejects the meeting, insulted that some kid who's half his age is treating him like an equal. A month goes by, and Philip finally recovers, and he begins his assault on the city in early July. His siege engines pepper Acre's walls, and the defenders signal to Saladin that they may not last much longer. Saladin responds by ordering his men to increase their attacks on the Crusaders, but Philip's presence at Acre seems to have been just what the Crusaders needed to finally take the city. And it's at this point in the story where we really begin to see just what kind of person Richard was. See, he's still super sick, but he can't stand the thought of Philip getting all the glory, so he sets up his own massive catapults, which were named, and I quote, God's own catapult and the bad neighbor, and he begins firing at the city to steal some of Philip's thunder. Richard then orders his men to carry him out on a stretcher near the front lines, and he begins shooting at the defenders with a crossbow while lying down, still looking half dead. The combined Crusader forces break through the city walls, and the defenders desperately plead for Saladin's help. The Muslims in Acre mount one final defense on July 11th, but by the next day, the city was captured, and the Christians take the defenders hostage. Richard sets the terms for the surrender. He wants Saladin to return the True Cross, along with 200,000 gold pieces and 1,600 previously captured Christian prisoners. In exchange, they'll return their 2,700 captured defenders from Acre. Richard gives Saladin a deadline and waits. King Philip and some other lords, having checked Go Crusading off their bucket list, return to Europe, leaving Richard to collect the spoils. But negotiations soon break down as both sides begin to demand their hostages be returned first, and Saladin ends up missing the deadline. This infuriates Richard, and he aims to send a message to the Sultan of the consequences of messing with the wrong dick. He has his men gather up the 2,700 Muslim prisoners, and he marches them up a hill called Ayadiyah. He orders his men to bound the prisoners and then begins beheading them in full view of Saladin's camp. Upon seeing the public execution of their brothers, Saladin's men charge up the hill to save them, but the Crusaders fight them off and force them to watch as they cut off the heads of each prisoner one by one until every single last one is dead. Saladin is enraged and in retaliation orders the immediate execution of his 1,600 Christian prisoners. An eye for an eye, and the rivalry that will make legends of the two men is off to a very disturbing start. With Acre secured, Richard begins to march his men towards the ruined city of Jaffa, which is about 80 miles away. His goal is to set up a string of fortresses that can be used to supply his men for their eventual push to Jerusalem. Saladin gets word from his scouts that Richard is traveling along this coastal path, and he begins planning an attack to wipe out Richard and the Crusaders before they reach the city. Now, Richard was arrogant, impulsive, and kind of a dick, but he was no idiot. He knew that extreme heat and lack of water were the key factors that led to the Crusaders' defeat at Hattin. So he has supply ships running the coast, constantly bringing his troops fresh water and supplies from Acre throughout their march. He also chose a path that allowed the sea to protect his flank. But unknown to Richard, Saladin watched the Crusaders from a distance, concealed in the wooded hills, waiting for the perfect time to strike. As Richard marched his men south, Saladin would periodically send his mounted archers out on hit-and-run attacks at vulnerable stretches of the road. The Christians are heavily armed and can defend against the light arrows, but these attacks take out their horses, and this slows them down. As Richard travels along the road, Saladin expertly moves his men in the cover of the woods, pacing with the Crusaders. Richard is oblivious to just how many Muslims are waiting in the shadows to attack him, until the morning of September 7th, 1191, when they near the ruined city of Arsuf. Richard is getting his men into formation to continue their trek when war drums and trumpets cut through the still morning air, and thousands of mounted archers screaming their battle cries begin to charge towards the Crusaders. The Christians look up to the wooded hills, and the full might of Saladin's army emerges from the shadows, and soon their numbers black out the horizon. Over 25,000 men. Richard's army is less than half the size at around 12,000. Like waves cresting over the hills, Saladin's archers swarm the Crusaders and launch a heavy barrage of arrows. The Crusaders defend themselves, but more of their horses and pack animals are killed. Richard commands his army to position themselves into a defensive formation and begin returning crossbow fire while continuing to move towards Arsuf. Saladin's army bears down on the Crusaders, and their march slows to a near standstill. Arrows continue to rain down on the Christians, and the Knights Hospitallers in the rear are getting the worst of it.
Richard, come on, bro, let us hold!
The young king carefully watches the movements of the Muslim soldiers, and he's suddenly stricken with terror as he realizes what the Sultan is trying to do.
My God, Saladin's tactics are designed to break our formation. If any part of our line retaliates, it will create a gap, and he will send cavalry into the opening. They will slaughter us from the inside out. The victory at Hattin was not a fluke. If I make a single mistake now, the cost will be the lives of every Christian.
Richard, bro, look, they shot more of our horses. Come on, man, you got less fight back. Hold!
The full force of the Muslim army bears down on the Crusaders, who are now pinned to a standstill and growing frustrated that Richard is holding them back. Sensing victory is at hand, Saladin rides behind his men, shouting words of encouragement over the drums, and the Muslims respond with increased ferocity. The archers begin to dismount and increase their rate of fire, and Richard and his men are completely trapped. Saladin's infantry then begin their march towards the Crusaders to finish them off. Seeing this, the Hospitallers again demand to charge, but Richard again instructs them to hold and wait for the signal.
This is some fucking bull. Yeah! Taste my steel, you dirty Saracen!
Oh, for f***'s sake. The Knights Hospitaller cannot take it anymore and break formation. They charge directly at the advancing Muslim force. More of the Crusaders follow their lead, and Richard realizes it's now or never. He had held his troops back as long as he could, and finally, he gives the signal for a full counterattack. The Crusaders' trumpets blare 6 times, and in unison, the Knights charge at full speed towards Saladin's men. The Muslims had been attacking the Crusaders for hours unanswered and had slipped into a false sense of security, and they're startled by the faces of the Christians who are now charging directly at them. Like tortured, caged animals who had finally been set free, the Crusaders roar and begin ruthlessly slaughtering Saladin's forces. Richard and his heavy cavalry smash into the archers, and in the blink of an eye, Saladin watches as his victory is snatched from his hands. He and his generals stand in disbelief as his men stream past them, fleeing in terror. Richard is leading the cavalry from the front and engages personally in savage hand-to-hand combat. The Sultan regains his composure and sees that the Crusaders have lost themselves to bloodlust. He quickly comes up with a counter-strategy and orders a full retreat into the woods. If he can lure the Christians into the shadows, he can regroup his men and ambush them. The Muslims race into the cover of the trees with the Crusaders in hot pursuit, but just as they begin to charge blindly into the woods, Richard commands them to stop. The Christians, against all odds, manage to fight back their instincts to continue the chase and stop themselves just short of Saladin's trap. The Sultan watches from the shadows as his strategy is again defeated for the second time today, and he recognizes that King Richard will not be easily defeated like the Christians he had fought in the past. Richard loses around 700 men in the Battle of Arsuf, while Saladin loses around 7,000 in defeat. The Crusaders celebrate their victory and continue on towards Jaffa, unaware that their destination would become the stage for the epic final showdown between the two legendary commanders. Richard and the Crusaders make it to Jaffa and quickly work to repair the fallen city. Saladin's scouts report on the progress made by the Christians, and he realizes that Richard is trying to set up a string of supply stations to Jerusalem. If Richard is able to do this, defending the holy city against a well-fed and well-supplied army of Crusaders will be near impossible. The battle at Arsuf has shown the battlefield abilities of the Christian king, so Saladin changes his strategy from direct combat to sabotage. He's about to show Richard that there are levels to this game of war. Saladin begins by destroying every port city and town en route to Jerusalem, starting with Ascalon, Richard's logical next destination. He knows that this will do 2 things. It'll force Richard to spend more time and resources building their own staging areas, and he's banking that the Crusaders will grow frustrated by the delays. Just as planned, Richard spent months refortifying Ascalon and spent more time fixing the destroyed forts along the road to Jerusalem. As time passed, the Crusaders became increasingly frustrated by the lack of action. They came here to fight, not to work as laborers, and Saladin's plan is playing out exactly as he thought it would. Throughout the entire time Richard was setting up supply lines, Saladin continued his hit-and-run tactics, which sunk Crusader spirits even further. and soon some of the knights began to leave and head back to other Christian cities in the area. Richard finds himself stuck between a rock and a hard place. He knows he needs logistics for any chance of success, but none of the other Crusaders seem to get it. They want to fight. They want to take Jerusalem. So eventually, they force Richard to make 2 attempts to recapture the Holy City, once getting within 12 miles of their goal. But both times, he turns them around when he realizes the risks are far too great. Seeing Jerusalem with their own eyes and then having to turn around without even attempting to take it crushes the last bits of morale amongst the Crusaders. Richard pitches a plan to take Egypt to cut off Saladin's supply lines, but they've lost faith in his leadership and refuse. Ironically, the only person who seems to get him is Saladin, and this is where the dynamics between the 2 leaders starts to get very interesting. See, both Richard and Saladin had been sending envoys to each other this whole time, trying to come to some sort of an understanding, and through these interactions, both Richard and Saladin begin to see their enemy in a new light. Saladin would often send his brother Al-Adil as the chief negotiator, and he and Richard actually became really good friends. So much so that Richard even offers up a plan where Al-Adil marries his sister to create peace through marriage. He didn't bother to ask his sister for her input on this arrangement, but hey, I guess it was a nice gesture. Through his friendship with Al-Adil, Richard's feelings towards the Muslims begins to evolve. They're not the monsters people in Europe said they were. Al-Adil is f***ing cool, and his brother Saladin, well, he's a wise and honorable king. But he can't really say this stuff out loud to his men. The rest of the Crusaders don't really feel the same, and they're getting more and more pissed that Richard is still not leading them to retake Jerusalem. Oh, and to make matters even worse, remember his frenemy King Philip of France? Well, Richard gets word that back in Europe, that dickhead is now working on a plan with his own brother Prince John, aka the bad guy in Robin Hood, to steal his throne and his lands while he's away in the Middle East. F***ing fantastic. Ugh. Everything seems to be falling apart for Richard. Despite not losing a single battle against the Muslims, Saladin's strategy had worked perfectly, and he has him on the ropes. Now under immense pressure, Richard needs to wrap this crusade up quick, and he travels to Acre to rally the additional troops he needs. Saladin is notified by his scouts that Richard's away, and he finally sees the opportunity he had been waiting for this whole time. With Richard in Acre, Jaffa was left almost completely undefended, and if he were to capture the city, Richard would be forced to try to take it again. The Crusaders would revolt to this plan, and without an army, the king's time in the Holy Land would be done. A complete victory without even having to fight him on the battlefield. And so Saladin quickly moves his forces to Jaffa to deliver the knockout punch. On the morning of July 27, 1192, the defenders at Jaffa wake up to the sights and sounds of an enormous Muslim army outside their walls. Saladin wastes no time and orders a full-out assault on the city. The Christians quickly send off a messenger to Acre and pray that he'll reach Richard before it's too late. The defenders do their best to hold off Saladin, fighting bravely though massively outnumbered, but the walls are soon breached and the Muslims storm their way into the city within 3 days. Fighting breaks out on the streets and surviving Crusaders are driven back into the citadel. The exhausted messenger sent from Jaffa reaches Acre in record time and delivers the dire news to Richard. He quickly gathers as many men as he can find and they board ships to make a beeline back to Jaffa. He understands the stakes as well as Saladin. If he doesn't make it in time, everything he had worked so hard for over the past year and a half would be for nothing. They arrive at Jaffa on August 1st, but the Crusaders begin to hang their heads in defeat when they see Saladin's flags flying on the city walls. They're too late. But suddenly, in the distance, Richard sees a man frantically swimming towards their ship. They pull him up, and he turns out to be a priest who was in Jaffa at the time of the attack. He tells them that hope is not lost. The Christians still live and are in the citadel waiting for you. They're ready to fight on. And upon hearing this, Richard grabs a crossbow and his sword, jumps off the ship, and begins to wade toward the shore. The knights on board follow his lead, and together they fearlessly advance directly towards the Muslim camp outside the city. Richard reaches shore and he quickly unloads a crossbow bolt into the first Muslim he sees. He then draws his sword and rushes headfirst into Saladin's camp. The Crusaders, swords drawn, follow their king, and they engage the shocked Muslims in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Saladin's men cannot believe the boldness of these knights, and Richard leads from the front, hacking and slashing his way towards the city walls. The banner of the Lionheart is carried into battle as more and more Crusaders follow Richard's lead and begin jumping off their ships and wading to shore. Richard and his initial strike force make it into the city and fighting breaks out on every street. The Christians in the citadel, hearing the sounds of combat, are startled from their stupor. They peer out and see the flag of King Richard flying in the wind and are filled with his courage. They pour out of the citadel and join their fellow crusaders in battle, now unafraid of death itself. Saladin is shocked and cannot believe what he's seeing. For a year, he had meticulously planned this battle. His execution was flawless. Jaffa had fallen. Yet now his soldiers are desperately fleeing the city. He orders the rest of his men to retreat, and they regroup a few miles away. As night falls, the crusaders within the city have a brief moment of celebration. Against all odds, Richard has again led them to victory. But the king knows that the battle is not yet won. Saladin had bet everything on Jaffa, and he will strike again. It dawns on both leaders that the next battle will be the final round in their year-and-a-half-long slugfest, and this will take place on August 4th, 1192. After Richard's epic rescue of Jaffa, he quickly has his men prepare defenses for Saladin's eventual counterattack. He dismantles his ships to create barricades and prays that the reinforcements from the north traveling on foot will reach them in time for the final assault. But unknown to Richard, Saladin had expected those reinforcements and had already sent troops to cut them off. Most of the forces Richard was banking on never make it to Jaffa. Saladin knows he cannot delay forever. Eventually, the Crusaders will rally more troops, and by his estimates, his current army still outnumbers the Crusaders at least 2-1. So in the darkness of the early morning on August 4th, 1192, the Sultan moves his entire remaining force to the city. In the early morning sun, a Crusader out on morning patrol catches the glint of armor in the distance, and Richard quickly mobilizes his men into a pre-planned defensive formation. They position lances into a menacing hedge to stop cavalry charges, and foot soldiers brace themselves, holding shields to deflect the coming storm of Muslim arrows. Richard then strategically places pairs of crossbowmen behind the shields. Saladin nervously arrives on the battlefield, but as he looks out at Richard's army, a grin creeps across his face. He counts no more than 2,000 men in total. He looks to Richard on his horse and counts less than 10 other mounted knights with him. The army he brought with him numbers around 15,000 soldiers. It seems God has finally chosen the victor for this year-long war. Saladin delays no further. War drums and trumpets signal the final round between Richard and Saladin, and his mounted archers begin racing towards the Crusaders. Richard's men steel themselves for the upcoming battle, and he gives the signal for his crossbowmen to let loose their first round of deadly bolts. Dozens of the Muslim archers are knocked off their horses, and the remaining riders are shocked to be greeted by an immediate second wave of bolts from the Crusaders. Richard had instructed his crossbowmen to fire in volleys. As one group shot, the other reloaded, and through this tactic, the Muslims are forced to deal with a steady stream of unrelenting projectiles every time they try to approach. The Muslims try to bait the Crusaders into a charge by faking a retreat, but after the first battle, Richard has regained the full trust of his men and no one takes the bait. The only things that chase the retreating Muslims are crossbow bolts that find their way into their backs. This goes on for hours, and both sides grow exhausted. The Christians from the constant loading and firing of their crossbows, and the Muslims from the constant dying. Though outnumbering the Crusaders 5-1, Saladin's men begin to wilt, and sensing his chance, Richard leads his small group of mounted knights into a full-blown charge, which is quickly joined by his infantry. After surviving hours of constant crossbow fire, the Muslims are exhausted and have lost their will to fight. They begin to run, and Richard leads the Crusaders in cutting down the Sultan's men as they attempt to flee. But just as victory seems all but secured, Saladin sends a group of his soldiers into the city. The Sultan's men quickly overrun the guards, and Richard is forced to pull a strike force from the battlefield and storm into the city to save the day again. Richard routs the Muslims in the city, and Saladin has lost all words. He had meticulously planned for every scenario, but it was not enough. Had he gone up against any other Christian knight, there would have been no chance of failure. But Richard was undeniably the greatest warrior he has ever witnessed. As the sun sets, the two exhausted armies pull back for the night. The Muslims had lost over 1,500 horses and 700 men, and the Crusaders had lost 2 but suffered many injuries in the battle. Richard had once again defeated Saladin in combat, but after a year and a half of constant fighting, the king's body finally hit its breaking point. At night, he breaks out into a debilitating fever that leaves him bedridden. Priests and other healers in the Crusader camp try their best to cure him, but Richard is so sick it looks like he might die. Saladin's scouts bring him the news, but instead of celebrating the coming death of his greatest enemy, Saladin is concerned.
"It's not fair. A man who had proven himself to be invincible in battle is betrayed by his own body? It cannot be.
In some versions of this story, Saladin sends his personal doctor with cooling fruits and ice from the mountain to treat Richard. The Crusaders, desperate for help, allow the doctor to treat the king, and he begins to recover. Though they've spent over a year trying to kill each other, neither the king nor the sultan can deny the greatness of their enemy any longer. To Richard, Saladin was an honorable ruler, fair to his people and enemies alike. A great king and a worthy rival. And to Saladin, Richard was the bravest warrior he had ever seen. A man without equal on the battlefield, though he probably still didn't really trust him. And so, on September 2nd, 1192, the king and the sultan signed a truce now known as the Treaty of Jaffa. Under this agreement, Saladin was allowed to retain control of Jerusalem under the condition that Christians be allowed safe passage into the city. The Crusaders will be allowed to keep their coastal cities, and neither side will attack the other for 3 years. The Treaty of Jaffa officially ended the Third Crusade, and Richard leaves for Europe to go deal with his asshole brother and frenemy Philip. Now, what happens to Richard after he leaves the Holy Land could be an entire video all on its own, so we'll save that story for another day. But as for Saladin, exhausted from the fighting that had consumed his life for nearly 3 decades, he passes away less than a year later. But stories of the chivalrous Sultan make their way back to Europe, and nobles throughout the land are fascinated by the tales of his tactical brilliance on the battlefield and the kindness he shows not only to his people, but his enemies as well. A Christian king and a Muslim sultan finding understanding and respect for one another through a series of epic battles in the Middle Ages may sound like some Hollywood BS, but it really happened. And it just goes to show that maybe the real Crusades are the friends we made along the way, or something like that. Here are the most horrific things Genghis Khan did to his enemies, ranked from bad to, oh my god, that is horrible. Number 8, offering his brother Bektir over a fish. So we all know Genghis Khan was a pretty brutal warlord. We're making a list of his most horrific acts after all, but he didn't grow up as that big a deal. When he was 9, his father Yasuge was poisoned by a rival tribe, and Genghis, then known as Temujin, and his family were abandoned by their tribe and forced to figure out how to stay alive on their own on the hardcore Mongolian steppe. Even though he was still just a kid, Genghis was out there hunting and foraging because now he had to provide for his family or they'd all starve. So this is what he does for years, and one day when he was 14, after a long day of fishing, he brings home some fish that he'd caught, and his half-brother Bektir just takes one and eats the whole damn thing all by himself. Like, what the hell, Bektir? This understandably pissed off our boy Genghis, and instead of conducting a constructive conversation based on the principles of nonviolent communication, he ended up deciding that it was better to simply shoot an arrow into his back instead. This led to the unfortunate consequence of his brother dying. Well, unfortunate for Bektir at least. Killing Bektir wasn't just a way to get back at him for not sharing food. It was also a way for little Temujin to establish himself as the dominant figure in the family. Bektir was kind of his mom's favorite. A little easier to be the favorite kid if there are less kids, I guess. Number 7, killing people even after he died. So this list is not in chronological order, and a lot happened between the arrow incident with Bektir and Genghis Khan's death. In 1227, his empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, but on his deathbed at the age of 65, he gave his final orders on how his body will be buried after he passed away. He wanted to be remembered as a god, and for that to work, he needed to make sure his corpse was never found. He ordered servants to carry his corpse into the wilderness so that nobody would notice. If anyone saw them as they were walking, they would instantly be killed. While some of his men went to bury his body, some soldiers remained at a distance standing guard. There are some legends that after burying his body, Genghis's men went as far as diverting an entire river to make sure nobody would find his tomb. These guys really took their job seriously. Anyways, when they came back from burying Genghis's body, they were all immediately executed by the soldiers standing by. Nothing personal or anything, but Genghis said, "No witnesses, so sorry, dude." According to some stories, the soldiers then ended their own lives to make sure the tomb's location was never leaked. But other stories say that these soldiers were all executed when they got back by another group of soldiers who were waiting for them. In any case, anyone who was involved with the burial of Genghis Khan died just shortly after he did. So even after he was dead, Genghis was still personally killing more people. Number 6, Inalchuk's punishment. Ever heard of the Khwarezmian Empire? It was a pretty big deal back in the day. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a caravan of around 450 men to a city called Otrar, bringing gold and various goods, hoping to establish a peaceful trade relationship. Pretty easy way to get on Chengis's good side, except the governor of the city named Anulchuk thought this was a spy mission, so naturally he started an investigation while the 450 men awaited trial. Oh wait, no, he executed the entire caravan and gave the goods to his friends in another city. If his half-brother eating a whole fish angered Genghis Khan, just imagine how he must have felt then. After a failed diplomatic mission, which resulted in another one of his diplomats getting killed by the Khwarezmians, Genghis Khan took a business trip out of Mongolia and completely decimated their entire empire. We're not talking about some little tribe here. Look at their map. Some estimates say about 10 million people died. Take a look of all that's left of Otrar. But that's not the horrible thing we're focusing on here, because any maniac can kill 10 million people, and we'll get to more things he did in Khwarezmia later in the list. For now, let's stick to Otrar and talk about what he did to Anulchuk, who was captured alive. After the regular, boring torture, Anulchuk is brought in front of Genghis, and as punishment for his greed, he orders his men to pour molten silver onto Anulchuk's eyes and face. It may have been into his ears, or his whole face, or his whole body depending on the story, but the point is that it was absolutely brutal. Number 5. Using human shields. Imagine how tough it must be to invade China back in 1211. At this time, the Mongols were still transitioning out of their nomadic horse-riding troublemaker phase to the empire-building phase, and they still hadn't figured out the whole siege warfare thing. When Genghis begins to invade territory in China that was controlled by the Jin dynasty, he's kinda stumped. These Chinese cities have huge walls with huge doors, and on top of that, they don't even let him in. Rude! The annoying defenders of these cities would also do things like shoot his men with arrows and plant booby traps and stuff. So, to minimize Mongol casualties, he came up with a brilliant idea: capturing civilians and prisoners of war to use as human shields, a tactic known as karash, meaning living boards. The Mongols would pillage surrounding towns and take prisoners to use as human shields. They would take these prisoners to the cities they were trying to siege and hide behind them as they were shot with arrows from the defenders. The prisoners being in the front of the line would also be the ones to walk into any traps that were intended for the Mongols. You might be thinking, human shields? That's not very original. But what made this extreme was Chengis's shields weren't just men. He included women and children in there too. Imagine what it was like for the Jin soldiers in the city to have to shoot women who looked like their wife or mom. Sometimes the Mongols took this tactic even further. During sieges, they would force the captives to carry siege equipment towards the walls, knowing full well that they'd be the first to get hit by the defenders' arrows, bombs, and boiling oil. Yeah, pouring boiling oil on attackers was apparently normal back then. And Genghis Khan didn't use this tactic just once. It became his calling card, showing he was willing to sacrifice anyone just to reach his goals. In fact, he was probably more than willing, he probably enjoyed it. Number 4. Siege of Jiangdu. So the Mongols spend a few more years trying to figure out how to get into these Chinese cities, and through this they get pretty good at it. By 1214, Genghis had destroyed a lot of Jin territory above the Yellow River and was sieging the capital city of Jiangdu, which is now modern-day Beijing. Genghis sends an ultimatum to the ruler of Jiangdu demanding treasure and for the Jin to become a tribute state of the Mongol Empire. The emperor accepts, and Genghis is like, cool, and he and his men begin their journey home. When Genghis leaves, the emperor and his generals make a break from Jiangdu and run away to Kaifeng to make it their new capital city. The idea was they could then rebuild a Jin army to defend against Genghis again in the future. Now this pisses Genghis off, and by now we all know nothing good happens when this guy gets mad. So in 1215, Genghis and his army are back in China, and his forces surround Jiangdu, cutting off food supplies and trampling crops, forcing surrender through starvation. A rescue mission with food and supplies is sent to Jiangdu by the emperor in Kaifeng, but is intercepted by the Mongols, and the people inside the city can do nothing but watch as the Mongols not only kill their rescuers, but also eat the food that was intended to save them. Days turn to months, and it gets so bad that the citizens of Jiangdu resort to cannibalism. Finally, the Mongols break through the city walls, and after months of being denied entry, they have lost any goodwill for the citizens of the city. When the Mongols storm in, they did what Mongols did and killed tens of thousands of people and took anything of value they could, including people with skills they deemed useful. It's reported that 60,000 women unalived themselves, choosing death over being taken by the Mongols. The city was set on fire, and the Mongols were only said to have left when the smell of death became too much for even them to bear. And that was only number 4 on this list. Number 3. The destruction of Merv. So we're back in Khwarezmia, and by 1221, Genghis has already destroyed the cities of Otrar and Samarkand. His forces, led by one of his sons, Tathlui, is assigned with the sacking of the city of Merv. Merv was one of the most prosperous cities in Khwarezmia, and its population was huge, estimated to be somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million citizens. By the time Chengis's army rolled up on Merv, everyone there already had heard of the horrific stories of the other cities, so the men there are ready to fight for their lives. After a week of trying to hold their tears and act tough, the city surrendered to the Mongols, hoping for the best. The best still being most likely pretty bad, but at the time, surrendering usually meant sparing the lives of the citizens of a city. Believing that the Great Khan would spare them, they willingly opened the gates and let the Mongols in. But remember, Chengis's time in Khwarezmia wasn't about conquest, it was about revenge. So once the Mongols got inside Merv, they were like, yeah, best we can do is slaughtering your whole population. The Mongols rounded up every man, woman, and child in Merv. Some estimates put the number at over 700,000 people and brought them to the plains outside of the city. They divided the people up into groups and then slaughtered almost every single one of them. Only a few artisans and women were saved from the massacre. They then set fire to the entire city, and the once great city of Merv was wiped off the map. Oh, and the Mongols wanted to make sure the city would be gone forever, so they even destroyed the water systems, leaving the land barren so that recovery would be almost impossible. This is what it looks like today. Number 2, destruction of Nishapur. Okay, we're gonna stick in the same time period, and Genghis is still hard at work wiping Khwarezmia off the map after the disrespect he took personally in Otrar. In late 1220, Genghis sends his son-in-law, Tokushar, to siege a city called Nishapur. These guys had originally surrendered to 2 of Chengis's other sons, only to renege their loyalty shortly after when they heard that some other cities were giving the Mongols some trouble. So Tokushar is there leading his army, and the people of Nishapur are fighting back pretty aggressively. In the battle, someone from inside of Nishapur shoots Tokushar with an arrow and kills him. Word gets back to Genghis Khan and his daughter, and guess what? They were not happy. Genghis sends his son Tathlui, the guy who just slaughtered everyone in Merv, to go and teach the people in Nishapur a lesson. The defenders of Nishapur only last a few days once Tathlui gets there and he begins executing Chengis's orders. Every living thing in Nishapur, man, woman, child, livestock, dog, cat, you name it, is rounded up and taken to a field outside of the city. Tathlui and his men proceeded to kill every single living thing that once lived in the city aside from a few hundred craftsmen that were spared and taken as slaves. The Mongols behead every single person and create 2 enormous piles of skulls, one of men and one for women and children. It's said that the blood ran so thick in the streets that it made the city a wasteland for years. Then, the entire city was then razed to the ground. Surprisingly, Nishapur was eventually rebuilt, and people actually still live there now in modern-day Iran. Number 1, erasing the Tangut civilization. Ever heard of the Tangut people? Probably not, because Genghis Khan ordered their civilization to be completely erased. The Tangut people resided in what's now northwestern China, and while they were culturally similar to the Mongols and other steppe peoples, they'd come under the rulership of the Tang Chinese and then set up their own kingdom in the 11th century called Western Xia. According to some stories, Genghis Khan, nearing the end of his life, gave the Tanguts one last chance to submit to him, which their king flat out rejected. He was old and frail, but not dead, so Genghis reacted in the same way he reacted throughout his life and led his army on one last mission to wipe the Tangut people from the history books. And so in 1226, the Mongols began systematically wiping Tangut cities off the map. The Tangut king has lots of regrets and dies of fear as he sees the Mongols getting closer and closer. Things are going good, but in 1227, Genghis is ill. Lying on his deathbed, he says, "My thirst for blood was misguided, and I regret everything." Nah, just kidding. He actually gave the final order for the total eradication of the Tanguts. In fact, he specifically told his sons, "I don't want anyone to ever mention them ever again, except if it's in a cool educational YouTube video." The Mongols were like, "Okay, sure, we'll obliterate the Tanguts for you. That's a perfectly reasonable wish." Not knowing what's going on with Genghis, the new Tangut king, who replaced the last guy who died, showed up shortly after bringing gifts and trying to surrender. The Mongols make him wait outside of Chengis's tent for 3 days before killing him. Too little, too late, I guess. With the sack of the Tangut capital city, the Mongols burned historical records, erasing much of the Tanguts' written history. Unique Tangut architecture was demolished. The Tangut language and script stopped being used, and to this day there are barely any remnants of it. They left some survivors, but they were forcibly relocated across the Mongol Empire and China. As they did so, they assimilated, which further led to the near extinction of the Tangut identity. According to historian John Mann, the eradication of the Tangut people may be the first ever recorded example of attempted genocide. Oof, that got dark, didn't it? Today, we're going over some of the most extreme stories of betrayal from human history. Number 1, Ricimer. Okay, we're kicking things off with a betrayal so extreme that it caused the actual fall of Rome. It's the 5th century AD, and the once mighty Rome has seen better days. Collapsing in on its own immense size, the Roman Empire split into 2 separate empires in 395 CE. The Eastern Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, seemed to take the breakup well and thrived for another 1,000 years or so, while the Western Roman Empire, they were struggling to keep it together. See, Rome was like that beautiful neighborhood that was once a great place to live that went to complete shit after decades of corruption and bad leadership. Germanic tribes like the Visigoths and Vandals were constantly invading around the borders of the empire, and without the political stability to field a proper army to defend itself, late Roman emperors were forced to rely on local barbarian generals and their armies of mercenaries. These barbarian generals grew in power and influence, and eventually the emperor was nothing more than a puppet figure to these warlords. To make things worse, Rome was hit with a wave of massive inflation that devalued its currency and made everything so much more expensive for its citizens who were already struggling to get by. The sacking of Rome by the Vandals in 455 CE seemed like the final death blow to the once mighty empire. But out of the rubble emerged a man who saw the chaos as an opportunity to seize power for himself. This man was named Ricimer, and he was going to do it all with the help of his best friend, Majorian. Ricimer and Majorian were friends forged in war. They fought side by side in numerous battles against barbaric invaders and rose through the ranks together. Both grew to become respected commanders, and many throughout Rome began wishing for one of them to take control of the empire and guide it back to greatness. And here's the thing. They both wanted that power, so much so that they worked together to orchestrate a coup against the Emperor Avitus, who they thought was doing a horrible job. With Avitus gone, Ricimer became the most powerful man in Rome. But there was one problem. Ricimer wasn't technically Roman. He was actually one of those barbarian generals mentioned before. And although Ricimer was the more decorated commander with better qualifications when compared to Majorian, not being Roman made him ineligible for the throne. So he decided he would instead get his best friend promoted to emperor and simply influence Majorian's decisions and rule over Rome from the shadows. Majorian becomes emperor in December of 457, and Ricimer could not have been more happy. That is, until Majorian started doing a little too well. See, Majorian actually turned out to be a phenomenal emperor, and he had his own ideas on how to make Rome great again. And his ideas, they were good. Majorian quickly took back large swaths of lost territory and dramatically reduced the corruption in the Senate. He instituted sweeping changes which made the lives of Romans much better, and in just a few short years, there was a glimmer of hope that the Western Roman Empire could possibly return to its former glory. This unexpected success pissed Ricimer off. This was not how it was supposed to go. In his mind, he was the one who would restore Rome's glory, not stupid Majorian. But before he could do anything about it, Majorian had already reclaimed most of Italy, France, and Spain, and he now planned a massive campaign to reclaim Rome's lost African territory. In preparation for this expedition, Majorian amassed a huge fleet in Cartagena, but under mysterious circumstances, the entire fleet was set ablaze just before the invasion, with whispers that Ricimer might have had a hand in it. The loss of the fleet was a huge blow, and Ricimer seized the moment and, using a combination of lies and bribes, tries to convince the Senate that Majorian was unfit to rule. Majorian, unaware of Ricimer's actions in Rome, traveled to see his old friend for advice. Majorian arrives unarmed and without guards, because why would he ever need that? This is his oldest and most trusted friend we're talking about. Well, the feelings were no longer mutual, and Ricimer and his men go out to meet Majorian on the road. Without flinching, Ricimer has Majorian arrested and kills all of his companions on the spot. He strips Majorian of his imperial clothing and then imprisoned and tortured him for 5 days. Throughout his time in captivity, Majorian wonders out loud why his friend would do this to him. Eventually, Ricimer had Majorian beheaded and unknowingly sealed the fate of the country he loved, as the empire would soon fall apart without a true leader. Ricimer tries to institute new puppet emperors, but they all fail, and Rome finally falls in 476. Number 2. Qin Hui. For this story, we're headed to 12th century China for a legendary betrayal of one of the greatest generals in history. A boy named Yu Fei is born on a farm in southern China in the early 1100s. This is a time of great instability, as the Jurchens from the north are at war with the rulers of China, the Song dynasty. As a young child, Yu Fei's father passes away in a flood, and he's raised by his mother, who instills a fierce sense of patriotism to his country. When the Jurchens begin invading Song territory, Yu Fei, now a man, is torn between his strong desire to defend his country and his dedication to take care of his now elderly mother. His mother asks him to remove his shirt, and she tattoos on his back the words, "Serve the country with utmost loyalty." Probably took up less space in Chinese. Anyways, now with his mother's blessing, Yu Fei joins the military and shows incredible skill in martial arts, weapons, and military strategy. When the Jurchens conquer the Song capital city of Kaifeng, Yu Fei joins the front lines and begins fighting on the northern battlefront. In combat, Yu Fei proves to be unstoppable. Legends of his bravery begin to emerge, and one story says he led 500 men to defeat an army of 100,000 Jurchens. He rises quickly through the ranks and soon finds himself commanding an army of loyal men known as the Yu Army, and he goes on to rack up an undefeated record against the Jurchens. What makes Yu Fei special is that throughout all the fighting, he maintains his humanity and shows extreme kindness and compassion for his soldiers. He personally tends to his wounded men, and when any of his men fell in combat, he would instruct his wife back home to send their own money to the soldier's family. For the next 10 years, Yu Fei and his men fought tirelessly to claw back the conquered northern Song territory, and he becomes a national hero. By 1140, he's within striking distance of the fallen capital city of Kaifeng. His dream of unifying China is now within reach. But if there's one guarantee in life, it's that success often breeds jealousy in others. As Yu Fei prepares for the final advance on Kaifeng, he receives orders to return home. See, the problem for Yu Fei is the former emperor of the northern Song dynasty was still alive and being held captive by the Jurchens. If Yu Fei was able to win and retake the city, this most likely would free the former emperor, and that would cause all kinds of problems for the current ruling class of the southern Song dynasty. Who would be the rightful ruler of the land? What would happen to those in power now? These were questions the officials close to the current emperor didn't want to have answered. A man named Qin Hui, a close advisor to this emperor, saw Yu Fei's growing influence as a huge threat. He convinces the emperor to make peace with the Jurchens, and just as Yu Fei is about to storm the city, the Song sue for peace and say they'll pay a tribute to the Jurchens. Yu Fei is furious upon hearing this news, but he begrudgingly follows his orders and returns south. All the land he had fought to regain is quickly recaptured by the Jurchens, and he can do nothing but watch. The fighting and the deaths of his men over the last 10 years were all for nothing. When Yu Fei returns to the capital, Qin Hui convinces the court to imprison him for conspiring against the emperor. He's thrown into a dark cell and subjected to months of torture in an attempt to force a confession. But Yu refuses to admit to crimes he never committed. Yu Fei eventually dies in prison at the age of 39. Some report that Qin Hui had him poisoned in his cell. Decades later, the truth of Qin Hui's involvement in Yu Fei's death was revealed, and statues of Qin Hui and his wife in a kneeling position were erected in front of Yu Fei's tomb as a symbol of their wrongdoing. For centuries, these statues attracted people from all across China who would come to pee and spit on the man who killed the greatest general China had ever seen. Number 3. Akechi Mitsuhide. We couldn't do a video on betrayals and backstabbing without doing at least one story from the Sengoku period in Japan. The Sengoku Jidai was a nearly 150-year civil war that took place in 15th and 16th century Japan, where regional warlords called daimyo fought to become the great unifier of the country. In this chaos, a minor daimyo from the Owari province named Oda Nobunaga began his rise to power using erratic and unconventional tactics, which quickly proved effective on the battlefield. Now, the thing about Oda that you should know is that he wasn't like most other lords. He dressed flamboyantly and was often seen with messy, undone hair. His behavior was fairly crude compared to most daimyo. He would make fun of his men and was known to have an irrationally quick temper. For example, he once had a retainer killed on the spot when he showed up late to an important meeting. Keep all of this in mind because this is probably what gets him killed later. Anyways, this weirdness also seemed to help Oda in war, and after winning a string of decisive battles against more powerful daimyo, he began to attract powerful allies and retainers. Many began to believe he was destined to be the one to reunify Japan. Nobunaga had many trusted generals and retainers, but the two we'll be focusing on for this story are Hideyoshi Toyotomi and a man named Akechi Mitsuhide. Toyotomi was a young military genius, while Mitsuhide specialized in diplomatic relations and governance. Oda trusted and relied on Akechi to help him govern his lands and quell rebellions, and while he was very loyal in return, he was sort of the odd one of the bunch. For starters, he was much older than many of the other retainers. He was even older than Oda himself. This, combined with the fact he was more educated than Oda, all made it hard for him to handle the disrespect that Nobunaga was known for. For example, in one story, Oda grabbed Akechi around the neck and said, "I'm going to make your head into a drum," and then proceeded to bop Akechi's head with a fan while singing a song making everyone in the room burst into laughter. But perhaps the biggest insult was the time Oda got Akechi's mother killed. In 1579, Akechi was ordered to capture Yakami Castle after the Lord Hatano Hideharu rebelled against Oda. As part of a peace agreement he negotiated, Akechi gave his mother to Hatano's men as a hostage in exchange for Hatano turning himself in with dignity. Hatano accepted the deal, and the exchange was made. Akechi's mother would stay with Hatano's men as insurance, and Hatano would travel with Akechi to see Oda to apologize. When Hatano arrives to meet with Nobunaga, he has him executed on the spot. Word of Hatano's death traveled quickly to Yakami Castle, and his men quickly kill Akechi's mother in retaliation. Now, whether or not these things were the actual reason for betrayal, we'll never know, but Akechi secretly begins to plot against Oda, and this all comes to a head in 1582. By this time, Oda has all but conquered Honshu, the main island of Japan. The last few unconquered domains are weak and will soon surrender, and Nobunaga has all of his best generals out in the field ready to crush them. He orders Akechi to take his army of around 13,000 men to support Hideyoshi against one of these last holdouts, the Mori clan. Nobunaga himself goes to Honnoji Temple to relax and prepare to join Akechi and Hideyoshi in the final glorious battle against the Mori. Honnoji is deep within Nobunaga's territory, in Kyoto, and because of this, he doesn't feel the need for much protection. He enters the temple for his stay with virtually no guards. Early in the morning on June 21st, 1582, Akechi and his men surround the temple and without explanation begin an all-out assault. They begin slaughtering priests and Oda's companions as they make their way through the temple grounds. With virtually no guards, Oda tries to fight back, but is quickly overpowered and injured. He retreats deep into the temple to commit seppuku, but before he dies, he orders his retainer to set the temple on fire so his body will never be able to be recovered. The temple is soon engulfed in flames, and Nobunaga's body is lost amongst the ash. With Oda dead, Akechi declares himself shogun. When word of Nobunaga's death reaches Hideyoshi, he quickly makes peace with the Mori clan and heads back to find Akechi to avenge his master. I gotta go. So can that guy, just kill himself? Okay. Thanks. Hideyoshi heads back to Kyoto, and Akechi is now scrambling for support. To his horror, because he cannot prove that he was the one who killed Nobunaga, no one wants to help him. Hideyoshi and Akechi fight in Kyoto at the Battle of Yamazaki, where Hideyoshi crushes Akechi's forces in just 2 hours. Akechi is killed as he tries to run away, and Hideyoshi assumes control of Oda's territory. Akechi's time as the self-proclaimed ruler of Japan lasted just 13 days. Number 4. Massacre of Glencoe. This last one is crazy because George R.R. Martin has said that this was one of the inspirations for the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones. It's the late 17th century Scotland, and while the area had been conquered and annexed by the British, the area known as the Highlands still remained largely run by family clans. These clans were groups of people connected by a common ancestor and were ruled by a clan chief who served as the protector of his extended family. Of course, like all neighbor situations, there were disputes and the occasional "he said, she said, you stole my goat" conflicts. But generally, these clans got along, intermarried to strengthen bonds, and tended to trust one another as fellow Highlanders. Above all else, the Highlanders were famous for their hospitality towards guests, as it was the most ingrained and important part of their collective culture. Remember this because that's part of what makes this betrayal so vile. So in 1688, King James is pushed out of England for being a little too Catholic and is replaced by the Protestant King William. James flees to France, where he hopes to find support to help him reclaim his throne. This leaves his supporters, known as Jacobites, unsure of what to do in the meantime. Many of the Scottish clans in the Highlands were loyal to King James, though not all of them, and this caused some division in the area. A Scotsman named John Dalrymple supported William during the Golden Revolution and is rewarded by being promoted to Secretary of State for Scotland, giving him authority over the land. Dalrymple does not like the Highlanders, and he knows the clans in the Highlands don't really like their new king, so he comes up with a plan to buy their loyalty. He offers the clans £12,000, a sum worth about $2.5 million today, to pledge their loyalty to their new king. This doesn't go as he planned, as the clans begin fighting over how the money should be split. The Campbells and the MacDonalds of Glencoe in particular get into it, because they have a history of cattle theft against each other and think the other family shouldn't receive any of the money. Dalrymple decides that the bribe isn't really working out, so he instead issues an ultimatum in August. Pledge your loyalty to your new king to an official sheriff by January 1st of 1692, or you will be treated as traitors to the crown and face severe consequences. The clans don't really want to go against their sworn allegiance to King James, but James gets word and sends a message to the clans to swear the oath to William, as he can't mount an invasion in time. The clans receive this message from King James in December, and one by one, they begin pledging the oath. The MacDonalds of Glencoe, however, for some reason don't get the message until December 28th. The chief of the MacDonalds, McCain, has just 3 days to make the trek in the harsh Scottish winter to swear the oath. He makes it to a nearby fort on December 30th, hoping someone there could administer the oath, but the governor stationed there says he was not authorized to do so. The governor writes a letter explaining the situation and directs McCain to bring the letter to Sir Colin Campbell in Inverary. McCain does his best to get there in time but doesn't make the deadline. Campbell administers the oath on January 6, 1692, 7 days late. McCain returns home thinking that he and his clan are okay because, yeah, he was late, but he got the excuse note from that governor. Plus, other clans were late too, so he figured everything was good. But things were not all good. Dalrymple hears that the MacDonalds were late with their oath and decides to make an example of them. He orders Captain Robert Campbell, of the Campbell clan the MacDonalds had a long-standing cow theft feud with, to bring 120 soldiers to the MacDonalds' home with orders for free quarter. Free quarter was the practice of offering soldiers food and shelter as a form of taxes, so McCain and the rest of the MacDonalds didn't think much of it when these soldiers arrived at their doorstep. Even though Robert Campbell was from that annoying Campbell clan, his niece was married to one of McCain's sons, so they were like extended family. The MacDonalds welcome in Campbell and his soldiers and treat them to exceptional Highlander hospitality. For 2 weeks, Campbell and his men are wined and dined and given the best sleeping accommodations the MacDonalds had to offer. Everything seemed fine, until the morning of February 13, 1692. McCain is awoken at 5 a.m. by his servant saying the soldiers were stirring. He tells his servant to bring the soldiers some drinks and begins to get dressed so he can send off his guests. As he's putting on his pants, one of Campbell's soldiers walks in and shoots him in the back. McCain dies on the spot. The soldiers then begin to storm each home, shooting men and women and children who are still sleeping in their beds. The commotion wakes up other members of the clan and they begin to run into the wild without food or clothing. The homes of the MacDonalds are torched and many who fled on foot freeze to death in a howling blizzard. The official numbers say the soldiers killed 38 people, but the actual number may have been much higher, as those who fled most likely died of hypothermia and were never found.